so I thought that I would tell my story. I live in the UK, and in autumn it gets dark at around 4 p.m. There was a school autumn break that week, so all the kids were at home, and that means that my girlfriend's brother was home too. I'd been with her for a year at that point, so her family knew me pretty well, and her brother enjoyed my company. She'd recently been pretty stressed out, though, because her parents were going across the country or something for the day, so she had to look after her brother, but I thought that I'd give her a day to herself so she can just cool off. I asked her parents if I could take care of their son for the day instead, and they agreed. So I came around at about 8 in the morning, and they let me in before they set off. My girlfriend's brother woke up about an hour later, I think, and she followed shortly afterwards. We went out for breakfast at a local cafe together, and went back to her house when we were done. And once I dropped her off, I took her brother to the park. We got there at about 2 p.m. The place was pretty packed. Eventually the sun started going down, and the place was completely empty by 4 o'clock. I texted my girlfriend and told her that we'd be home in a bit. She said okay. I'm going to be honest, though, I completely lost track of time. Me and her brother were just having so much fun being the only two in the park that we just forgot. Me and her brother were stood on the top of this really tall climbing frame with a slide on it. It was almost pitch black at this point, so I was using my phone as a flashlight. A notification popped up on my phone screen, and it was my girlfriend asking where we were. I responded, "Oops, coming home now," and told her brother that we had to go. He sighed and asked if we could go down the slide, and I said yes, why not? Before I went down, though, I knew what the park looked like. There were streetlights all around it, benches everywhere, some trees, and places for the kids to play. When I came out of the slide, there was something weird, though. A man had appeared out of nowhere and was stood beneath one of the streetlights. He had a trench coat on and a beanie hat, and I immediately got my girlfriend's brother behind me and called out to the man with a friendly, "Hi there," and I got a response. He started groaning. I noticed that he was swaying back and forth in the light, and he had his mouth open, drooling, with a sort of blank look in his eyes. And this man, he made me feel really uneasy instantly. I picked the little bro up, and I kept checking on this guy the entire time. There was an exit on my left that led to the path back home, so I left out that way and kept checking behind me every few seconds. The guy was still stood there. The path where the guy was stood emerges with a big main path if you walk out through some bushes, and so does the one that I walked through. I was walking down the path for about maybe 2 minutes, I would guess, periodically checking behind me, of course, and thought that I was in the clear, but I wasn't. I was on a straight stretch of path with lots of streetlights when I saw him again. He was stood beneath one, looking up at it, and he was playing with something in his hands. I looked closer and realized that it was a knife. I kept walking and walking, checking behind me constantly. Girlfriend's little brother was so scared that he had his head tucked into my chest. I noticed that the guy seemed to be moving to new streetlights whenever I turned around. Initially, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, to be honest, but I started counting them and realized 2 streetlights behind him had definitely turned into 5. I could faintly hear the groaning noise still, and he was occasionally moaning as well. I picked up the pace a bit, and I turned a corner, getting into the last stretch of the street before I got to my girlfriend's house, and that was when I heard him behind the row of bushes. That moaning noise sounded angry now, and I heard his heavy footsteps bounding down the path quickly, which meant that this guy was running. I immediately broke into a sprint, and I didn't stop until I turned into the alleyway at the front of the street and got behind my girlfriend's house. There's a big bush there, so I crouched down behind that and spammed her phone with messages to open the back gate. I hugged her brother close until she opened it for us and got us in quickly, but man, did it feel like years that we were out there. I went to the front of the house and had it confirmed that I'd managed to shake him. He was now in the street, circling where I had been, outside of the alleyway just moments ago. And yes, he was still moaning. He had that knife in his hand still, and he started kicking people's bins over in anger, I think. I called the police immediately, but he was gone by the time that they arrived, and as far as I know, they never found him too. Strangely though, there was a similar incident near the area a few months ago. I saw it in a local Facebook group, but I don't think anything came of that one either. In the end though, her parents thanked me for keeping their son safe and didn't hold any ill will against me for the situation. He went back to normal pretty much the day afterwards, which was good, but he still has nightmares about the event. And when my country isn't in lockdown again, I'm still allowed to look after him with my girlfriend. Funnily enough, I suppose. But we haven't been to that park ever since, and I still check over my shoulder and break into a cold sweat every time that I'm alone in the street these days. For context, I'm currently 22 years old, and it happened back in December of 2008, or maybe January of 2009, but I was around 10 at the time. I live in Estonia, which is in the northern part of Europe. This is important too, since during the heart of winter, we have only about 4 hours of daylight, and it's fairly dark from around 3 p.m. until at least 11 a.m. So, the story takes place in a resort roughly 80 kilometers east from the capital, Tallinn, where I had gone on a trip with my school class. Everyone was super excited since it was our first trip where we also spent the night. A rather popular thing to do back in that day was to make these sort of makeshift Ouija boards on paper and use a ring on a string above it that would swing lightly, pointing towards certain letters or numbers for answers. Nobody ever really took it seriously, mind you, and mostly it was considered this kind of prank that older kids played on younger ones. We called it calling out the spirits at the time. So obviously though, as kids, we do not think twice before doing it. Well, we thought it was fun. Roughly 10 of us gathered around, make the makeshift board and the ring on the string thing, and mostly just goofed around with it, asking very cliche and dumb questions like, did you die in this house? Are you going to haunt us tonight? If yes, reveal yourself somehow, etc. But nothing happened throughout these sessions as far as I remember. Perhaps some more sensitive kids got a bit creeped out by it, and maybe they left and the others accused the one holding the ring on a string of pointing to certain things on purpose, but well, who knows what really happened. And that's not what this story is about anyway. So it had to be around maybe 8 or 9 p.m, and teachers were encouraging us to get to bed since some of our classmates had gotten caught imitating smoking by rolling a tube out of newspaper and lighting it on fire and smoking it. It was already pitch black darkness outside, so it was pretty much time for bed anyway. I was sharing my room with another guy from my class. His name was Mike. The layout of the room was 2 beds parallel to each other with about a 1 meter gap between them. One was closer to the corridor door where I was sleeping, and the other was closer to the opposite wall that was almost entirely covered by the glass balcony sort of door thing. Basically a huge window, and that was where Mike was sleeping. So we were both sitting on the edges of our beds with the big light turned on, getting undressed and getting ready to get into our beds. Mike was sitting facing my bed and the corridor door, and I was sitting facing his bed and the huge window. So I stood up to take off my shirt when I saw it behind the glass balcony door. At first, my brain didn't quite register what it was since the light was on in the room, and I thought it was just my reflection or something, until it moved a couple of steps to the left and started turning around. All of this happened while I was standing in place and Mike was sitting on the bed. But I completely froze for what felt like a long time. And man, to this day, this is still the scariest moment of my life, 100%. Because it was like a light golden, sort of light peach-colored human-sized thing was just standing there. As soon as my brain registered, this is not your reflection, I sort of made a bit of a gasp-like sound and flung myself to the bed and covered my head with the pillow without saying a word. I must have gone completely pale too, since Mike started asking me, what's wrong, what's there? Me with my head still in the pillow asked, is it still there? And he asked, is what still there? I'm not looking before you tell me what's there. So, little by little I turned my head up towards the window side of the wall, convincing myself that I'm just seeing things and this can't be real and I have to look again. But boy, was I majorly wrong. When I turned my head back, I immediately turned it back inside the pillow, and cold shivers ran through my entire body, because what I saw was the same light, golden light, peach-coloured shape standing behind that glass door. It had no distinguishable neck or arms or legs, but it roughly resembled a sort of humanoid silhouette with two black eyes. I kept my head in the pillow for what felt like a long time again, but most likely it was probably a couple of minutes. And when I turned my head back next time, it was gone, and we went on with our evening by talking about random stuff as kids do until I fell asleep. To this day, I still don't know what it was or what it could have been, but I had the idea of sharing it here now since my friend sent me a huge collection of true scary experiences from other places on the internet, and I thought that I should share mine. I know it's a bit of a weird one, and I don't really have any answers. I have no idea what it was, but there was definitely something or someone there, and there's no way they could have jumped down from the balcony because it was way too high. You would die for sure. Plus, it's not like it was adult size or anything. It was small, and whatever it was, it definitely had completely black eyes. Anyway, feel free to ask for any additional details, and I'll try my best to provide them in the comments below, but it was 12 years ago, and my memory of the rest of the trip is pretty foggy, so I don't know how much I will remember. But if you got this far, then thanks for listening. This is something that happened when I was younger, and it's always just stuck with me. I must have been around 8, and my sister must have been around 6, I think. My mum would take us to our grandpa's house, her side, very often. Her mother, my grandma, she passed away when my mum was only like 9 or 10 years old in that house. And there was this one time that I remember sitting in the living room with my mum, sister, brother, and grandpa. My mum and grandpa were chatting while us kids were playing. I had to go to the bathroom really bad, but for some reason was afraid to go alone. I asked my mum to take me, but since she was talking to my grandpa, she told me to ask my sister. My sister didn't want to go with me, even though I begged and begged, and in the end, I finally decided to just go it alone. Now, the bathroom was a decent size. You would walk in and you would pass a huge sink countertop with a mirror covering the wall, and then the toilet and the tub would be at the end. I remember walking in, and I can't remember if I closed the door or not, but I probably did, I think. In any case, as I walked in, I sort of gave a side glance to the wide mirror, and I saw my sister walking behind me, smiling. I turned around to yell at her for making me beg so much and saying no to just come after all, but when I turned around, she wasn't there. The bathroom was completely empty. It was so long ago, and I was so little, but I think I even remember hearing her voice. I couldn't tell you for the life of me what she might have said, though, but I think she did say something. Either way, I quickly ran back to the living room to tell my mum what happened, and ask my sister if she had followed me after all. And my sister swears, even to this day when I bring it up, that she never followed me into that bathroom. My grandpa doesn't live there anymore, and I don't know if my mum ever believed me, although she does believe in the paranormal, so who knows. I really don't think that my sister did follow me, but if she didn't, then who or what did I see? This happened back when I was a freshman in high school. I had this friend who lived next door to me and asked me to accompany him to Dairy Queen to buy a vape mod from some girl from his school, but we'll call him Tyler. So after school I met up with Tyler at our apartment complex since school had just let out for him as well. We walked to Dairy Queen, which was about 1.5 miles roughly up the street. This was in the middle of winter, so it was very cold and rainy, and so the walk took about 30 minutes. We arrived at the Dairy Queen and waited an hour for this girl who never showed up. She eventually texted Tyler after an hour of telling him that she was getting ready, and she said that she was unable to get a ride, which was BS because she apparently lived right by the Dairy Queen. We were annoyed and started to walk back home. We were talking about how we were going to hit the hot tub when we got back. Now, for some understanding, there was a large Walmart that you had to pass to get to Dairy Queen. And before you get to the Walmart, there's another apartment complex that we had to pass. A girl named Carly lived there and was dating our friend Dre, so we stopped at her apartment because Tyler saw her outside taking out her trash and wanted to flirt with her, which is something that he would do with every girl that he came across. But when we got there, she was visibly upset and you could tell that she'd been crying. She told Tyler that Dre had dumped her. For a bit of context too, Dre was once best friends with Tyler, but they had a falling out a few days prior to this story. All three of us would hang out at the apartment complex that Tyler and I lived at, and Dre was actually a long-time family friend of mine too. So after a few minutes of Tyler and Carly chatting, we finally left and we just headed home. As we were about to pass the Walmart, there was a big bush on the sidewalk in front of the Walmart, and as we were walking, we saw two dark figures emerge from behind the bush and look in our direction. Tyler had a lot of enemies, so he was paranoid that it was someone coming after him. I told him not to worry, as it could have been anyone, and was probably just some random homeless people, as this area was full of random transients. He suggested, though, that we cut through the back alley behind the Walmart because he was fully convinced that it was someone who wanted to jump him. I'll admit, too, that I was a bit nervous myself, as I wasn't sure what kind of enemies that he had or what they wanted, and I was afraid that they would do something to me since I was with Tyler, which in hindsight was probably a bit selfish, but hey, I was a kid. So we decided to just continue down the sidewalk that we were on and take our chances, agreeing to just book it if they tried anything. The closer we got to the sidewalk, the more sketchy the whole situation got though, because these people just kept peeking around the bushes at us. Once we got to the bush, I was surprised to see Dre, and also a well-known thug named D, come out from behind the bush. Dre looked really pissed, and he had a weird grin on his face that made me know that they were up to no good. I also noticed that D was holding his cell phone at a kind of weird angle, like he was recording or something, and that made me really nervous. Dre and D just walked up to us on the sidewalk, with D still awkwardly smirking at us, and Dre asked us where we were coming from. I didn't say anything, as I didn't want to be involved in the beef Dre and Tyler had with each other. Tyler began to try and explain to Dre that we were coming back from the Dairy Queen and that we ran into Dre's girlfriend, Carly, and that Carly was upset over their breakup. Dre didn't believe him and accused him of trying to hit on her. He said that they never broke up and accused Tyler of lying. Tyler attempted to get me involved by looking at me as if he expected me to confirm that Carly in fact said that they broke up. I froze up and I just shrugged my shoulders and tried to make it clear that I wanted no part of anything. Dre didn't say anything for a few seconds, and then after an awkward silence, Tyler attempted to part ways and walk up the street after saying goodbye to Dre. All of a sudden, Dre just shoved Tyler to the ground and then sucker punched him in the face as he crawled back to his feet. D began hysterically laughing in a very menacing way, and I just kind of stood there looking at Dre, waiting for him to come after me. You see, the night before this, I had gotten into it with Dre over text and called him a little bitch because he wouldn't forgive Tyler. I know that was immature now, but like I said, I was young and I was a kid and I was stupid. To my surprise though, he walked past me without doing anything to me and walked up the street in the opposite direction. Now, by this point, Tyler was hysterical and started running up the street yelling at me to come on now or they're going to get me next, and I was trying to keep up with him. He yelled at me for not helping him, and at that moment, Tyler's mum pulled up next to us and we got into the car and she drove us home. He was crying at this point and told his mum what had happened. She kind of seemed dismissive of the whole thing and just said to stay away from Dre. I was just happy to be away from the whole situation, to be honest. Tyler went straight into his house though and didn't talk to me for a few days. I guess he was mad at me for not helping, and in my defense though, everything happened so fast that I really didn't know what to do. Dre ended up texting me after I got home just saying hey, and I just ignored the message. The next encounter with D was a bit more alarming though, as he apparently did indeed want me to text. Tyler and I were just hanging out at the apartments one day when he got a text from one of his friends that Dre and Dee were smoking weed at the supermarket right next door to the apartments. Apparently Dre told Dee how I was best friends with Tyler and had been talking shit, to which Dee responded by suggesting that they walk over to my apartment to beat my ass. Dre told him no though because we were family friends, and so that was that. I didn't see Dee again until high school when he was put into my algebra class. He walked into the classroom with that same creepy smile on his face that he seemed to always have, and sat down across from my desk. He turned to me during a quiz and asked me if I remember him, to which I replied in the affirmative. He asked if I remembered when Dre punched Tyler, and once again I said yes. This kid went on about how he enjoyed watching Dre do that to Tyler and how he actually had 2 knives in his pocket that day and wanted to use them on Tyler, but Dre wouldn't let him. So, fast forward to 2018, I was walking around Sears with my fiancée trying to find baby clothes for our son, who was due soon. I hadn't heard anything about Dee or Dre since high school, and I received a text from an old buddy from school telling me that Dee got arrested for allegedly shooting some girl in the back of the head at a party. Apparently, she refused to sell him coke, so he shot her in a fit of rage, and he fled the scene and was arrested soon after that on attempted murder charges since the girl actually survived. She also ended up making a full recovery, which is quite amazing. But this wasn't the first time Dee had shot someone, allegedly. A year prior, he shot some kid in the leg in a drug deal gone bad, and I'm not sure if Dre is still friends with Dee, but as far as I know, he's not involved in the things that he used to be involved with. So, thinking back on that day when those 2 jumped us and they had those knives, perhaps we avoided something terrible that day, and maybe we were lucky. Myself and my best friend John were young Boy Scouts, and we really enjoyed camping. Working toward our merit badges, we had to camp some distance away from others, without a tent and minimum of supplies. A .22 rifle, handheld CB radio, small amount of rope, and some knives, and that was about it. One of the knives was one of those ones that had a compass and a fishing supply in the handle. We spoke with our parents about camping on a local mountain. They agreed, and we were off. So we walked down some abandoned railroad tracks that ran along the mountain. We walked for about 4 miles from my house and hiked to the top of the mountain where there was a clearing. You could actually see the clearing on the mountain from John's front porch. Our fathers joked about how they could see any fire up there using binoculars, and they wanted to see a fire burning all night. During our hike, there was nothing out of the ordinary. We spent a lot of time on the mountain, and we used old logging roads halfway up before taking small trails to get to the clearing. On the way up, we passed a young couple in their 20s or so. We waved to them, but we didn't speak to them. Around 3 p.m, we reached the clearing, and we started constructing a small lean-to and building a fire. The area that we were in was wide open with little to no trees, lots of stones and huge boulder rocks. The huge boulder rocks were actually a landmark for our parents, as you could see them from everywhere pretty much. And for the next few hours, nothing really happened. We checked in on the CB radio every 2.5 hours. We used the local firefighter channel on the CB radio. This channel was an off channel that the local fire department used to chat about off-the-topic stuff like NHL games and fart jokes and stuff like that. Every time we checked in, about 20 people would respond, jokingly, but it was an awesome sense of security, so we didn't mind. Like I said, nothing out of the ordinary happens. That is, until around 11 p.m. The only reason I knew what time it was because we had to check in within about 30 minutes. We were sitting around our fire just talking and joking about who was going to call on the CB this time. That's when we heard a loud booming noise, and it wasn't a gun because we knew what they sound like. This was like a 10-second boom that reverbed on itself, and the ground vibrated softly. We looked at each other, and I said, "What the hell was that?" John made this huge smile on his face and made a joke that I farted. We laughed, and I pointed towards some of the large boulders where the sound seemed to have come from, and jokingly said, "Your ass is over there then." Now, John is someone who was always fearless, so he got up and continued to make jokes as he walked over towards the boulders. John, just out of the firelight, I could hardly make out his outline on the night sky. I remember his exact words when he said, "You hear us? Come here us, you be..." I laughed and said, "You be what, John? You be what?" I waited no less than 30 seconds, and I got up and walked towards John, just knowing that he would jump out scaring the crap out of me. As I walked towards the boulder, where I last lost sight of him, bracing myself, I remember saying, "If you scare me, I'm going to shit on you when you fall asleep." I reached the boulder, and I couldn't find John. I yelled for him to come out, give up, come out. About 5 minutes of searching around, and then, over the large boulders, I got just extremely scared. I don't know why, but just a sudden pain of grief fell over me, and I was just petrified. Well, I ran back to the fire, grabbed the CB radio, and started screaming for my dad. "Dad, John is missing. I'm scared. Dad, I think someone is after me. Dad, Dad, Dad." To this day, I don't know why I instinctively started screaming into the radio. Thinking about it all these years later, too, it was only 5 minutes since I had seen him, but for some reason I just felt really scared. So many people on the radio responded, "We're on our way, keep the fire going so that we can find you." Then my father said the words that have haunted me, and as I share this, it brings sort of fear back into me. He said, "Brian, grab your rifle, put your back to the tallest rock, and shoot anything that doesn't have a flashlight." To this day, I still don't know why he said that. He never would tell me, and he took why he said it to the grave as well. But I did as I was told. I dropped the radio and grabbed the .22 and put my back to a rock still within the light of the fire. It felt like a lifetime, but it was only 20 minutes after my dad said what he said, and half the law enforcement and fire department showed up. I remember from where I was standing, I could see the headlight and the flashlights of the emergency vehicles coming towards the mountain, up the old logging trail and toward me. As they pulled up, everyone was yelling, "Brian, don't shoot, we're here, don't shoot." There were around 50 people that night that came to my cries, and they wasted no time searching for John. But no one could find him or any sign of where he went. The only thing that we found was the large knife that had the accessories in the handle and the flashlight on the top of the boulder where John went missing. This was really odd too, because these were in the lean-to with the leftover rope stuff that we had. So how the hell did they get there? Anyway, they searched for 3 days. I was interviewed by everyone in the law enforcement, but before I was interviewed by the FBI as well. The young couple was interviewed and nothing. They were woken up by all the vehicles and the emergency sirens. When the FBI got involved, they took my .22 rifle and had it checked to see if I'd recently shot it. I hadn't, obviously. They took the knives and checked them over, and they took my clothing and everything. They brought me back up the mountain, had me reenact that night. I also remember that they called me a murderer. They said that they knew that I'd killed him and I was going to jail forever. Mind you, I was only 11 years old, and this went on for a year. I used to go over to John's house and speak with his father and mother every day, asking if he had come home yet. I remember the first time his mum actually said to me, "Where is my baby? What did you do?" She said this to me every day. She would come over to my house, sit in the driveway, and I would walk out and she would roll down the window and say that in a soft voice. John's dad, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He would talk to me and was always super nice to me. He still is to this day, and I call him every time that I think of John. Even now to this day, he never says anything out of the way towards me. John's mother had actually passed some time ago, and from what I was told, her last words were, "Ask Brian where my baby is." But to this day, no sign ever showed up of John. No body, no clothing, nothing. It haunts me still, and I have nightmares a lot still. I'm always writing down my nightmares too in a journal, hoping that I would write something that I'd forgotten, but It's almost always the same. Nothing new. The mountain where all this happened now has loads of houses on them, and they started building houses there in the late 90s. I remember going with John's father one weekend, and we searched the area when they were clearing the trees that were around that clearing, but we found nothing. Anyway, this is my story, and it's defined me and molded me into who I am today. It's affected me in just so many ways, and it's going to haunt me right to the end, I think. I'll answer any questions as best as I can, but just know that obviously all the names and everything have been changed in this story for anonymity. I did call John's father and I asked if I could share this, and he said okay. He's an elderly man now, and I really don't want to bring any more unrest to the family than has already occurred. This was many years ago now, in a time when there was still magic in my life. The Easter Bunny still left a basket for me every year, Santa delivered presents, and the Tooth Fairy would leave money under my pillow when I lost a tooth. I could not have been more than 8 years old, I suppose, but I'm almost positive that I remember being younger, possibly as young as maybe 6 or 7 years old even. At the time, I had a bunk bed that I shared with my younger sister. I am the older sister, so of course I wanted the top bunk, which was rightfully given to me. Now that I'm an adult, I know that it's probably because my sister was only 3 years old when we got it, and my parents likely feared that she would fall in the night. If I was 6 or 7 at the time of the event, she would have been 4 or 5 at that point. Either way, though, I had the top bunk and she had the bottom. We were both very young at the time, obviously, and my parents kept a lamp in the room at night for us. My mum would always say that she would leave a light on so that we could see if we had to get up to use the bathroom and stuff. I do not remember when we stopped using the lamp in the room, though. I think that my parents just wanted to save some money on electricity. I think I prefer there to be a source of light if my eyes are going to be open. I remember very vividly the light from the lamp on the shelf at the back of the room, too. And that's the first thing that I noticed when I opened my eyes. I just remember that one minute I was asleep, and the next thing I knew, I was aware. The light was on across the room on the shelf. I was just sort of slowly taking in my surroundings. In retrospect, I think it was my instincts. I guess we just don't understand them or question them as much when we're young like that. But we just do or act and suffer the consequences later. The number of, why did you do that? I don't know, interactions. Too many to count sometimes, right? Anyway, I think now that I had felt something watching me and it had woken me from somewhere in my dreams. And the fact that I didn't notice it standing there first is honestly phenomenal. It's weird writing it out like this too, because I've never had to think too hard about the details. The first thing I noticed, though, as I said, was the other side of the room where the lamp was. I always slept with my face pressed up against the bars of the safety rails on the upper bed, so seeing out wasn't an issue. Maybe my face wasn't pressed right up against the bars right then. I don't remember if I sat up a bit too to look around or what, but I just remember suddenly being awake, being aware. I was awake, seeing the room, my light, and then I noticed, standing right at face level with me, was someone, or perhaps something. I really don't know what it was. Still, I only looked at it long enough to register, and it scared me. It appeared to be like a smiley face, I think. I can't express to you how creepy that is, though. It didn't have human proportions in its face, that's for sure. I registered 2 eyes, but didn't see if they had pupils or what color they truly were. My memory tells me that they were completely black, like a smiley face. I didn't recognize a nose. I would describe it like maybe the nose of Voldemort, except I don't even remember there being nostrils. Perhaps a sort of bump, just a slight raise where a nose should be. But the smile, I think, is what really freaks me out. It was disproportionately very long for the face, and I don't think I remember it showing teeth, but it was staring me dead in my eyes, looking right into me, and acknowledging that I was seeing it. As I mentioned earlier, this was a time that magic was still alive in my life. A time where the first thing I would do when my child brain recognizes and registers something right in front of me as a threat is hide under my blankets. I didn't scream, I barely even breathed. And I think that's what made me know that it really happened. Because anyone would and could easily have written it off as just a dream or a trick of the eyes or something. But no, my heart was pounding under there. I'm not sure why I thought hiding would help, but I had looked at dead in its creepy eyes, seen its dreadful smile, and it would have known well that I knew that it was there. Little kid logic, I guess, but I felt like I had been hiding under the blankets for what must have been 10 minutes. I stayed under there until my own carbon dioxide had overaccumulated and I could barely breathe right. I sort of peeked out again, and when I did, it was gone. Now, I only got a good look at it for maybe 1 or 2 seconds. I didn't see a body, so I don't know if it was humanoid in that respect or what. But because of the height of where my bunk bed is at, I would say the face was standing at about 5 foot tall. Again, though, I didn't see any teeth, couldn't tell anything except maybe voids for eyes, didn't see any hands, it didn't touch me, not while I was awake anyway. But I was so young at the time, the fear was too easily overriding curiosity. I was horrified when I saw it, of course. It's not like I saw a stranger and they told me to go back to sleep or something. But I definitely saw something. And to this day, I honestly have no idea what it was. It was just a really, really creepy smiling face that I so lovingly dubbed the Smiley Face Man. I never mentioned it to my parents, and I never asked my sister if she ever felt or saw anything too. I'm not even sure why I kept it to myself for so long, if I'm being honest. Maybe I thought it would never make a difference even if I mentioned it. I don't know. I would also like to add that my family has always kept safeties and boundaries on the house, so I honestly don't think that it was evil. I think that it was scary, but just maybe not malicious. I really don't believe it could have entered the house otherwise, so I don't believe that it had ill will or intention of harm. It doesn't make it any easier to get past, believe me, but it woke me up and was right in front of my eyes. It was gone when I came out of hiding, and I've never seen it since. It was just a one-time thing, I suppose. Anyway, this is basically me just reaching out. I don't know what I saw, and if anyone has any real answers, I would be elated to at least humor them for research purposes if it's not what I'm looking for. I want to know of anyone who has had at least a similar experience. I don't know if it was an entity or a spirit or some kind of being, or if maybe I just had 7-year-old sleep brain that constructed a literal child's nightmare, with the lights on, mind you. If any of you guys could help me out here, then that would be much appreciated. So this happened in my very first relationship. I was almost 21 at the time when I met my ex. I'd never been kissed, never had even been on a date, but somehow I got myself into a relationship with this guy that had helped me with studying for one of my tests a few years ago. Looking back, the relationship itself was also full of major red flags. I don't want to go into detail, obviously, because that's not the point of this story. But essentially, he sometimes told me, I wish that I could rape you. Bear in mind that he first told me that a few days after I had my first time with him. He also always laughed and smiled creepily when women in movies were beaten up, murdered, or raped. He also always laughed and smiled creepily when women in movies were beaten up, murdered, or raped. When he saw such scenes, he always smiled creepily and told me, "This is a nice scene," etc. He told me, too, that he liked the look of beaten-up women. And to be honest, I just had the biggest pink-colored glasses on and thought that things were just jokes. Anyway, one evening when I met him, he asked if we could meet a friend of his. I told him, of course, because I had never met any of his friends before. so we drove to his friend's flat, and everything was good. When I was there, they immediately got their shisha, some kind of water-smoking device, no drugs included, and lots of alcohol ready. My ex knew that I never drank, but he begged me to do it, just this one time for him, so I did. It was this kind of extremely sweet, sort of strawberry-tasting alcohol in an extremely huge bottle. We sat and talked, smoked the shisha, and we drank, and, well, I drank. Recalling the night, though, my ex and his best friend only had one drink, but once my glass was empty, they immediately put more liquor in it and told me to drink some more. And to be honest, I don't know why, but I did. At the time, I didn't really think about them still being on their first drink, while I had already finished my third or fourth, or even fifth, I think. But I was getting drunk and also feeling extremely unwell. The friend of my ex told me to take off my hoodie, which I did. Thankfully, I had a top underneath. And once I did, he complimented me on my body, and that I shouldn't have come here dressed like that. He touched me by the neck and shoulders and tried to flirt with me, while my ex was right there, mind you, still always giving me more and more liquor. I tried to get away from him, but he got closer again and tried to play with my hair. I was very uncomfortable, but already so drunk at this point that I didn't tell him to get lost. Then my ex and the friend got up and were talking about something in the corner of the room. My ex came back to me, and for about 30 minutes, the friend of my ex was nowhere to be seen. My ex began making out with my drunk self. He tried to undress me, but I denied it, telling him that I was on my period, which was actually true. And once I told him that, I could see that he was upset and almost slightly angry, in fact. He got up and got his friend, talking to him again, but this time I could see that the two were looking kind of frustrated. I know that almost immediately after that, my ex and I went to my ex's flat, because we were told to go. But after that, I can only really remember the morning. My ex told me jokingly that I had passed out right before the bed. I had the worst headache that I had ever experienced in my life, though, and I had my ex go and give me a bucket because my stomach turned and I had to puke so badly. I called my mum to pick me up, and while waiting, my ex told me, sitting on the bed, that his friend would want to have sex with me so badly. And again, you know that I have the fantasy of raping you, right? And my mum picked me up, and when I was home, I shortly passed out in the bathroom, but after that, I recovered, thankfully. My ex mentioned the things about his friend wanting to have sex with me a few times after that too, and asked me right after if he could give him my number. And a few months after our breakup, his friend sent me a message on Facebook saying that he wanted to meet me. Looking back, I'm pretty sure that those two wanted to get me so drunk that I had no more control and then both have sex with me. The only thing that got into their way, I think, was my period. It was such a creepy evening, though, and all the things that could have happened with my ex after that led me to believe that. I, for example, recall a time when there was news in our country about a very drunk girl being raped by two men, and he always said she was drunk, they did nothing wrong, she wanted it. Disgusting, I know. It's just sad, though, that my rose-colored glasses didn't let me see that when we were still together. I should have run away immediately after he told me first about his fantasies, but on a happy note, I now have a boyfriend that treats me like I'm the most wonderful person on earth, so that's good, I suppose. My siblings and I, we spent most of our time with our father, but every other weekend, we went to see my mum, who lived with her mother. They moved around a lot too, and eventually moved to a multi-family home, where we got the basement apartment. And if I had to guess, I think I was around 12 at the time. One of the first things I was told about the house by my grandma, though, was that the house had been around since the Revolutionary War. People unfamiliar with New England may not know how commonplace that is, really, especially in the area of Connecticut that I'm from. Plenty of houses around me were built in like the 1600s and the 1700s, Many of them even have plaques on them with the year date. Now, I always felt just terrified in that basement for some reason, but I didn't even think that that was really unusual, to be honest. And I don't know why, but I just never asked myself why I felt so scared all the time. But I always felt like I was being watched, or that there was some other presence near me. It's difficult to put into words, but at the time, being a kid, I just treated it as if I were in a movie 24/7. What I mean is that I sort of felt like there were cameras all over me all the time, and that there was an audience monitoring my every move, even when I slept. At the time, again, though, I didn't attribute this to ghosts or paranormal activity, and I really didn't have any explanation for it. But I felt it most in the bathroom, and I would try to spend the least amount of time there as possible, running in and running out, always thinking that somebody was there. I also always had trouble falling asleep there. My brothers and I all slept in the living room, me and one brother on the pull-out couch bed, and one would sleep on the armchair in the corner. My grandma had her own bedroom, and so did my mum. My mum eventually left. She sold her car and phone and went off with some man that she just met, and we honestly lost contact for years. When she left, I took over her bedroom on the nights that we stayed with our grandma, and sleeping in that room was even more terrifying. I always heard scratching in the walls in my mother's old bedroom. They seemed to me to come from inside the middle of the wall between her room and the kitchen. At the time, I figured it must have been mice, though I had never seen or heard of mice being an issue in the apartment. But the bedroom door would also open on its own, even though my family confirmed that they were not opening my door. I also remember before I would go to sleep, I would always close it as properly as I could, pushing it hard, making sure that it sort of clicked, and yet I would always wake up with the door slightly ajar. Again, at the time, my explanation was that my mother had one of those behind-the-door shoe racks with tons of shoes hanging off of it, and I figured that maybe the weight was pulling open the door, though I had never seen it open with my own eyes, and I couldn't get it to open that way myself, which was a bit weird. Finally, though, I went back to sleeping in the living room and never going into my mother's old bedroom again. One night, I stayed up late reading, using the browser on my DS. My brothers were both asleep in the room with me, and my grandma was in her bedroom with the door closed. I turned my DS off at about, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, I would guess. I faced away from the kitchen, looking towards my brothers, and I heard a sound that I didn't recognize. Then, after a couple of seconds, I heard it again, and then again, and I realized that the sound was coming from the refrigerator door opening. I sort of froze and strained to listen closer. I heard the fridge door open, then after about 4 or 5 full seconds, close, and then open again. This happened over and over for a few minutes too. I was way too terrified to turn around though, so I just continued laying completely still, frozen in terror. Under no circumstances would I ever have turned around to see what was opening this fridge. I eventually just moved my gaze, looking more to the side, where I noticed that I could also see the light emanating into my view every time the fridge door opened, and turning back every time that it closed. Eventually it stopped, and I must have passed out at some point. But in the morning I told my grandma and brothers about what happened, and confirmed that none of them were messing with the fridge. I also tested the door, and it wasn't one that would just pop open, and you really had to yank on it to open it. Anyway, the families upstairs moved in and out, and all the time, just constantly. Nobody ever lived there very long. But eventually even the landlord decided to live somewhere else, and well, we were the only family living in the entire building. And at that, we decided that it was time for us to move on as well. Towards the end though, at some point, I went outside to hula hoop, and I swear that I saw a shadow watching me from one of the upstairs windows. I never went into the backyard ever again after that. I was just too petrified. I also walked around the perimeter of the huge house on my last day there, and noticed on the side that there was a door at the same level as our basement apartment, but I had no idea where it could have led because there was no other space in our apartment that I hadn't seen, and no other doors too. This door was padlocked, zip-tied, and the handle had rope and bungee cords tying it closed. And I don't know what it was about it, but the sight of it just left me really unnerved, and I ran back into our apartment immediately upon seeing it. Eventually, though, when we moved out to another apartment, I must say that I noticed a different feeling almost immediately. I felt safe for the first time and never felt like I was being watched. And that is when I decided that I think I believe in ghosts. So I was 8 years old, living in the middle of a cornfield in Shelbyville, Indiana. Our closest neighbors were more than half a mile away, and the closest store was like a good 15-minute drive away. My mum was actually told by the landlord that her mum hung herself here in the barn outside and that she actually haunts the place. My mum obviously didn't believe her, but she still told us to freak us out. Anyways, I was getting ready for school one morning and I'm sitting on the couch tying my shoes. I had the living room light on and the kitchen light on as well because I was scared of the dark, so everything was well lit. If I look directly to my left, there's a hallway that goes straight into the kitchen, and directly in line with the hallway is my kitchen sink. So I heard some clanking to my left and look over, and I kid you not, a fucking kitchen knife was floating towards me. In that moment, it felt like my heart stopped, and I went into panic mode for a second. I screamed for my sister upstairs, and as soon as her foot hit the stairs, I watched this knife do a quick 180 and shoot back to the sink, stuck in the wall, and then fell in. I was hysterical and couldn't stop bawling my eyes out. I tried to cry, explaining to my sister what had happened, but she never believed me. I took her over to the sink, and sure enough, there was a cut in the wall that lined up perfectly with that knife. This whole experience was so vivid that I can see it happening in my head still as I'm writing this. This was my first, but not last experience with paranormal entities, and it's something that I'll never forget. When I was in elementary school, I had a problem with this boy. His name was Curtis. So, at the start of 3rd grade, Curtis joined my class, and immediately everyone could tell that he was a little bit off. He would have meltdowns in class and throw things across the room, even biting others and threatening to kill our teacher. And even though Curtis was a little more than scary, I felt bad for him and would try to help him through his freakouts. I would talk to him and invite him to play during recess. And this was the beginning of a huge mistake. So after this, Curtis began to stalk me. I know it's funny to say that a kid is stalking another kid, but that is honestly exactly what it was. He would follow me home and show up at my family members' houses asking for me. He would write long stories about me and him having sex. He would pass them around the school, making sure everyone saw them. And the stories were extremely graphic. The school even had to get involved and advised him that if he didn't stop, that they would need to contact his parents and the police. And he didn't stop. And unfortunately, the school didn't keep their word. He would chase me down and pin me to the ground and kiss me, lick my face, grope me, all that sort of stuff. He would tell me that he loves me and that I'm going to have his babies. As we got older, he would bring a camera to school and take pictures of me. I would plead with him to stop and would tell the teachers what he was doing. They would confiscate his camera, but would always give it back at the end of the day. He would even tell me that he would print the pictures out and, well, you get it, to them, making sure to emphasize that he loves to finish on my face. This lasted all the way up until the very last year of middle school. I decided to go to a different school to get away from him. I had also moved and made great lengths to make sure that he never found out where. I asked my family to take alternate ways home so that he would never see our car, and I essentially just dropped off the face of the earth. Years go by though, and I saw an old friend from middle school and started to catch up. Out of curiosity, I asked about Curtis, and boy, do I regret asking more than anything. She looked shocked and was like, "What? You didn't hear?" Well, He kidnapped a 15-year-old and he fled the state. Her parents are still looking for her and he's wanted. Curtis would be about 19 or 20 at this time. I checked into the story when I got home, and sure enough, it was true. Well, during high school, he would find my social media accounts and attempt to contact me, but I blocked him every time. I can't help but think, too, that if I hadn't have moved schools and changed my whole life around, could that have been me? Locked away in a van somewhere with Curtis? I got lucky. While I'm in intensive therapy for all the things Curtis did to me, at least I'm not locked away and never to be seen again. A stint of warm weather came through our area a few weeks ago, so my family and I decided to hike our local Appalachian trail. We were 25 minutes into our hike when my wife stops abruptly as if she was spooked. With my daughter sitting in her hiking seat attached to my backpack, I slowly shift us in the direction of my wife. What we came across was a large rock off the trail that had been spray painted with a Bible scripture. I read it out loud: Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, Daniel 5:23-28. The urgent style of the writing and its intensity was unsettling to my wife. It was just really odd to see this kind of graffiti so far off the beaten path. But the AT attracts all walks of life, so I guess someone did it. I looked up the interpretation, and it goes: Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. As I'm looking this up, my wife just wants us to keep walking and starts up the trail, and then I hear the cracks of branches just off the trail behind me. I just kept that interpretation to myself, as I know it'll just really creep out my wife. Another mile into the trail, and more crackling of more branches behind us. In the intelligence community, there's a rule of thumb regarding being tracked by a person or a car. 1 time equals an accident. 2 times, a coincidence. 3 times, enemy action. Coincidentally, it would be very unusual for deer to follow us. So I turn around to what's making these noises, and in the woods off the trail, I spot what appeared to be a man crouched over, messing with something in his bag, whistling to himself. I thought that he probably just took a piss off the trail or something, but I knew this guy had been behind us on the trail for quite a while now because of that first noise that I'd heard. Not even 100 feet further down the trail, yet again I hear another rustle and a crunch of branches. I turn 180 degrees, and the man is about 20 feet in front of me, just adjacent to the trail. I look at him, but he doesn't make eye contact, just looks sporadically at different things, from the ground beneath him to the trees and then looking up to the sky. And then, while looking to the sky, he says, "The days of Babylon are numbered, mene, mene." I reply cold and clinically, "Hey, are you lost, buddy?" I can feel my adrenaline pumping, my ears faintly ringing, and my heartbeat pumping double time. Now I'm starting to think that I'm going to have to defend my family from a lunatic. He continues to mumble, giggle, and then just turns around and walks off into the woods. I don't know what his intentions were, but I have a feeling that he knew that we weren't soft targets. This all happened when I was about 19. I'm not the best looking dude, so I've never really had much luck with women, and I ended up on Tinder. I wasn't having much luck there either until, like, the 3rd month of using it, when a blonde woman named Katie messaged me. She was pretty enough that I just dismissed her as a bot. It wasn't until 3 days later that she messaged me again, which was odd because bots almost never message more than once. I clicked on her chat and replied, then looked at her profile. What I saw was pretty generic, but definitely wasn't a bot's profile. We'd been talking for like a month when she proposed the idea that I come and see her. I was pretty reluctant, I'll admit, as she lived nearly 8 hours from me by car, but I had to admit that I really did like her quite a bit, and I'd been thinking about asking her if I could come and see her for a while now. After a bit more badgering from her, I finally said that I would take the drive to go and see her. At this point, I really had no reason to doubt that she was who she said she was. We had video chatted every other week and called most days, and I just assumed that I honestly just got lucky. Things did get a little weird on the way there, though. She kept messaging me, asking me where I was and making sure I was still coming. At some points, when I took more than 30 minutes to respond, she'd send me a slew of annoyed texts. Admittedly, I had just chalked this all up to her being nervous about coming to see her. I was pretty nervous too, so I couldn't blame her. But I had a bit of a hard time finding the place at first. The directions she gave me were pretty confusing, and it was back through a series of gravel and dirt roads and a large thicket of trees. It was still about midday when I came onto an old-looking house. A window on the second floor was boarded up, but it didn't look abandoned, just worse for wear. Katie's red buggy that she liked to talk about was parked in the front of the garage. I took out my phone and texted her that I was here. She only sent a smiley face in return. When I got out of my car to go and knock on the door, I noticed that someone was looking at me from one of the second floor windows. I found it a little bit creepy, but figured it was just her father or something. She had told me a few times that he comes to stay with her every now and again, so I just ignored it and knocked on her door. She answered with a smile and even gave me a kiss, which surprised me, and I followed her inside. We sat down on a couch and started talking about our plans when I asked her about her dad. "Hey, you didn't tell me that your dad was here," I said. "Was that going to be a surprise, or?" Katie looked confused and told me that her dad wasn't here. I still thought that she was keeping up the act, and I told her that she didn't have to keep pretending, and that I had seen him looking at me through the upstairs window. And Katie went pale and said that we had to get out of there right now. We both ran out to our cars, and when I questioned Katie, she informed me that her dad wasn't there and that she had been home alone until I showed up. I called the police, and while I was on the phone giving the address, Katie gasped and pointed to the window where I had seen the guy last, because he was looking at us from out the window again. I got a better look this time, and he seemed older and frail, almost like he hadn't eaten anything in a while. He left the window after he saw that we saw him. The police took about half an hour to show up, and the whole time Katie was crying and mumbling about how she was an idiot for not keeping her doors locked. When the police finally did show up, one started asking me and Katie questions, and the other two searched the house. They came back out a little later and told me and Katie that while they didn't find anyone, they did find that the back door was hanging open, which means that whoever it was ran out into the woods, but the cops were sure that the house was empty. After the cops left, Katie asked me to stay the night because she was too scared to be in her house alone right now, and I gladly did, and we slept downstairs on the couch as Katie's bed was the room next to the one the man had been in. Katie had also brought out the shotgun that her father had given her, but she never used. I told her that it was fine, the man was gone, but she insisted, saying that she'd feel safer if we had it out. And boy, am I glad that she did. Later that night, I was still wide awake watching TV. Katie had somehow managed to fall asleep, but from the kitchen I heard the sound of a doorknob being turned. And at this point, I wasn't even scared anymore. I was just really pissed. I flipped on the light in the kitchen and pointed the gun at the kitchen door, and there he was. The guy that had been in the house before was standing on the other side of the glass door. He looked shocked, and I'm glad that we had locked the door. But eventually the man unfroze and yet again ran into the woods. I woke up Katie and told her what had happened, and we called the police yet again. When they arrived, they did a sweep of the woods and found no one yet again. They told Katie and me that it'd probably be a good idea to stay somewhere else for the night. Me and Katie said our goodbyes, and she was going to stay at her friend's house, and I was going to go home. I left a little after Katie did, and I was on the phone with my brother telling him about what had happened. My headlights were on, and as I was talking, something caught my eye. It was that man standing at the corner of the house just watching me. Well, I gunned it out of there, and I didn't even bother calling the police again, but I did text Katie, and she said that she was going to call them again. Somehow, though, I really don't think that Katie is ever even going to want to go back to that house alone again. This happened to me when I was about 12 or 13 years old or so, about 15 years ago, and also I'm a female. So the town that I lived in has developed a lot since this story, but when this happened, there were a lot of factories spread out with lots of land in between them. There was a Walmart being built in the area, but it had barely started construction at the time. There was a main highway that ran through there, but my mum didn't like taking it as much, as traffic would get pretty bad most of the time there. The side streets you would take were desolate and not much light. There was also little to no cars taking these streets, but I can't remember where we were coming from that night. In the car that night, though, was my mum, my brother, who was 3 years younger than me, and me. My mum is obviously driving, I'm in the passenger seat, and my brother is sitting behind me. My mum is the sweetest person ever, but is very adamant that she will never stop to help somebody on the side of the road or pick somebody up, especially when her kids are in the car. She does, however, make sure that she calls the police so they can help them. Anyway, it was around 9 p.m. and we were going home when my mum and I spot someone on the side of the road by the passenger side with their hood up. Nothing out of the ordinary, as my mum slows down a little since it's dark outside and doesn't want to harm anybody that might be fixing their car and accidentally step out or something. As soon as we're close to the car, though, this guy steps out from around the hood of the car towards the street and is waving us down. I don't really remember much of the description because I wasn't paying too much attention at the time, plus I can barely see this guy, but I do remember feeling bad that we weren't at least going to stop to see what he needed. The man at this point is in the middle of the road waving his hands, but as we come up on the car, we don't see anybody else in the car. So my mum swerves around him and tells my brother to find her phone in a purse that was in the floor between the front and the back seats. I look at my mum as she looks in the rearview mirror, and her face goes completely white, and her eyes get really wide. My mum quickly slams her foot on the accelerator. This is highly unusual for my mum, of course, as she's really good at going the speed limit. But at this point, I knew that something was very wrong. My mum's voice goes high, and in a panic, she's asking my brother where her phone is. I'm yelling at her what's going on. All this chaos is freaking my brother out, and with him being so little, he's now crying and can't find the phone. My mum keeps her eye on the road, but keeps glancing up continuously at her rearview mirror, and finally answers, "He's following us." I'm not exactly sure what she was talking about, but know that this is not a good situation. My mum is speeding towards the highway, and thank goodness there's no traffic. I look out the back window and see somebody passing cars trying to keep up with my mum. I ask her where she's going, and she told me that she's heading to the police station. As we're getting close, my mum tells me to jump out of the car as soon as she stops the car, grab my brother from the back seat while she runs around to the car to meet us. My mum stops right in front of the police station and doesn't even wait for the car to fully come to a stop before she puts the car in park. I open my car door as fast as I can and grab my brother, who has quickly opened his door. I take off in a full sprint with my brother in one hand and my mum on the other hand. And once we finally talk to a police officer is when I finally understand the full extent of what happened. So my mum told the police officer that once we had passed this guy with a broke-down car, he quickly ran to the hood of his car and slammed it. He then got into his car and sped after us. And that was when my mum knew that this guy was up to something horrible. She said that he kept trying to speed up to get onto the side of us, but she was able to speed up to avoid that. Once my mum turned toward the police station, she said the guy had stopped following her, but still wanted to get to the police station, just in case he changed his mind. She gave the best description of the guy and his car that she could, but because everything happened so quickly and it was pretty dark, she didn't get a license plate number or anything. I'm pretty sure that the police never found this guy, and I'm also not sure what the guy had planned for us if we had actually stopped to help him, but I know that it was definitely nothing good. Anyway, all I can say is thank God for my mum. I've sort of debated sharing this because, well, I know it sounds crazy, but it did actually happen, and my ex experienced it as well. In fact, we still bring it up from time to time when we see each other. So, I used to live on the EBCI reservation in the Smoky Mountains. There's a spot called Thomas Divide, and it's been known for decades to have sort of unexplained floating orbs and all sorts of weird things. You're supposed to pull off at the lookout, flash your lights 3 times at the mountains, and just wait there. It's a known phenomena that's even been written about, but one night, my ex and I decided to go and check it out. We drive up to the pull-off at night, park on the left part of the clearing, turn off the vehicle, flash our lights 3 times at the mountains below, and then we wait. It's dark out, but the pull-off has basically a gravel clearing surrounded by woods, and the moon was full, so you could see the whole area pretty well. We could both see the entire area around the car, and there was nobody else there. We both had our windows rolled down. Most of the pull-off area that we're in is to the right, since we pulled in more to the left, and we're facing toward the mountains now. We were just talking, having a nice time, and my ex flashes his lights 3 times again since nothing had happened yet. I have my arm hanging out my window, and I'm just looking up at the stars, and I've sort of loudly announced that this is stupid and that nothing is happening. And well, immediately after my announcement, we start hearing the sound of footsteps at the end of the clearing, heading in our direction, toward my side of the car. They were coming fast, but sounded light and quick, like they belonged to a small person, so maybe like a child running? I am skeptical at first and figured that there must be an explanation. It's quite bright from the moon, so I can see everything, but I'm just not seeing anything running in my direction, although I can clearly hear the gravel crunching and the sound of footsteps. I start hanging out my window, straining to see what could be heading in our direction, because obviously there must be an explanation, and I want to see what's coming towards us. The footsteps eventually come right up to my door too, and then something physically hits my door. Mind you, I'm actually hanging out my window at this point, looking at my door and the ground next to it, and I never saw a thing. However, whatever invisible thing that ran up to us to hit my door with enough force that it made a banging sound, like someone had punched it, and the car rocked slightly, you could see and hear the impact, but couldn't see what made it. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear to you that this is exactly what happened. My ex's eyes got big and asked if it was me that did that. He thought that I was playing with him, though he had heard the footsteps and knew that those had nothing to do with me. And I told him no, that I didn't do that. And at that, he reversed his car as fast as possible and sped out of there and back home as quickly as he could. He was looking all around outside as well as once we heard the footsteps, but he never saw a thing too, or what was making the footsteps either. He could only hear them like I could. This is one of the most unnerving things that has ever happened to me. It was the 4th of July, and my brother and I were setting off fireworks in the woods behind our house. We were passing back and forth an aim and flame cigarette lighter, and lighting firecrackers and other small fireworks. It was around 2 in the morning, 5th of July. I left to get something to drink, and I left my brother there lighting fireworks. I get back around 10 minutes later, and he's asking me for the lighter, and I told him that I didn't have it. I left it with him, and he was actively lighting firecrackers as I left. He says, "Yeah, I know, but I just gave it to you a couple of minutes ago. Where is it?" Now, I know my brother, and this just isn't something that he would lie about. We've talked about it many times over the years too, and the story has never changed. The moon was bright that night, bright enough to see, and he says that he saw me in my same outfit, same face, same hair, and everything. Apparently, I said nothing, went up and put my hand out. My brother assumed it was because I wanted the lighter. He gave the lighter, and whatever it was, apparently just walked away and never said a word. These were woods privately owned by my family, by the way, far out in rural Texas. Nobody else was out there, and if they were, that doesn't explain how they looked exactly like me. We continued setting off fireworks till around 4 in the morning, having to use a short cigarette lighter because whatever it was, it stole the aim and flame. We never did get it back too, and the whole thing is just really creepy. So I was out walking in the woods at an ungodly hour of the morning one day. I believe it was around 1 or 2 in the morning, and last year I was working at a church youth camp in Wisconsin. The camp was on 2 sides of the highway, and a tunnel underneath the highway connected the 2 sides of the camp, so the campers could more readily access the other side. My then girlfriend and our friend, they liked to walk the woods at night after we were done with work. The first time we had done this was pretty terrifying because we were startled by a fox barking. The deer in the woods were fairly docile and didn't spook easy, but we soon learned to identify the sound of the fox, and we actually saw it several times. Now, one night it was just me and my ex-girlfriend walking through the woods, and as we rounded a corner in the trail, I noticed movement in the field by the tunnel and sort of grey shapes there. I assumed that they were deer and pointed them out to her. We continued our walk past the tunnel, but just as we passed the entrance to the tunnel, maybe about 20 yards, we heard the most horrendous screeching that we've ever heard. It sounded as if someone was being strangled, in fact. It didn't sound at all like a fox, but in the end we just sort of walked away quickly and shrugged it off. We continued up the road when all of a sudden I had a weird feeling and turned about to see a tall figure standing in the road. It seemed to be dressed in all white and was all sort of hazy-like. I honestly wondered if I was just a little too tired and was seeing things at first, so I poked my girlfriend and asked her to take a look behind us. But she immediately noticed it too. Something we both noted, though, was that our eyes kept sliding off the figure. We couldn't sort of keep our vision centered on it, which was really strange, but I was thinking this, and she voiced it without me saying anything. I pulled my hunting knife from its sheath, but somehow I just knew that it wasn't going to do anything. Without looking away from the thing, I said, "Let's go now." We backed away and then started running. We didn't stop until we were back to the cabins, but when I got back inside the cabin, the guy in the bunk next to me was still up texting his girlfriend. I quickly told him what we had seen, and he looked at me and said, "That's why I don't go out at night." And after that, I just never went back out into those woods at night again. And when I talk about this, I still get chills and a bit of a nervous feeling, to be honest. Now, we had no drugs or alcohol, and we were both under 21 with no mental health issues, and we were working at a church camp with strict policies, so I have no idea what it was, but to be honest, I don't know if I want to find out either. This happened about 12 years ago, but I remember it vividly. I was waiting at the Orlando airport for my mum to fly in for vacation to see me. My daughter, she was a year at the time, and my then fiancé were there too. Her plane had been delayed due to weather, and it was getting later and later. When finally the airport was almost empty and it was pretty much midnight, I needed to use the restroom and told my fiancé to hang onto my daughter's stroller as he was falling asleep. I was not tired. I was actually pretty excited to see my mum, and I had drank a few coffees by this point. So I went into the women's room, and every stall door was open. I chose a random one and used it. All the while, it was completely silent in there. I left the stall and was washing my hands. The bathroom had a mirror that went all the way across the wall, and I didn't see anything. But while I was washing my hands, I got a really weird feeling. I had been looking down at my hands the whole time, and I looked up, and all of a sudden there was a scary-looking woman standing right behind me, almost touching me, leaning right into me. We sort of made eye contact in the mirror, and she said, "Jesus loves you, do you know that?" In a really freaky way too. Obviously, I was really freaked out by that and just sort of nodded while staring at her in the mirror. She then walked away, and I couldn't see if she left the bathroom or not due to the design of the exit, but I was shaking over the exchange because the tone she used, it was almost like she was saying that Jesus saved me from her doing something awful to me. I never heard her come in, mind you, and I'm a pretty paranoid person, so I pay attention to listening for people and things. Plus, those bathrooms echo so much, I definitely would have heard footsteps. I also never saw her hands, so I really don't know if she had a weapon or not, but maybe she did. Either way, I timidly left the bathroom, and my fiancé was standing near the bathroom holding my daughter. I asked him if he saw that lady, and he had no idea who I was talking about. I looked around the area, though, and it was completely empty, just us in there. I don't know where she went or whatever happened to that woman, but that face will forever haunt me as long as I live. So, this is going to be a really long story because it took place over the span of about a year, and I'm going to tell you as much detail as I can. Honestly, though, I know that it sounds so much like a horror movie script that I won't blame you in the slightest if you don't believe a word of it. I've never shared this on the internet before, but all of my friends know about this series of events. I'll also try and keep this as coherent as possible and give some backstory. So, here goes nothing. I'm 30 now, and when I was in my teens and early 20s, I was really into weird stuff. There's a few local shops that sell unusual oddities and antiques, like art made from dead animals and skulls and pickled specimens, and things like that. I started pickling my own specimens around age 20, when I figured out that it wasn't that hard. I did have some articulated skeletons, but stuff that I was really interested in was the supposedly cursed stuff. I bought things people claimed were cursed on eBay, and even drove to different states to buy things from people they claimed were haunted. I bought 3 different diebuck boxes supposedly cursed from eBay. I bought numerous haunted dolls, whatever I could find really. I had some weird taxidermy items too, like a couple of 2-headed baby chickens, a snake with 2 heads, etc. I had a few things that I wasn't supposed to have either, but I won't go into those ones. Long story short though, nothing weird ever happened. Not a thing. I never had one unusual, creepy experience with any of this stuff. I should also start this off by saying that I've never really believed in the paranormal or supernatural. Like, I wouldn't say that I'm a skeptic or anything, because I think to use that term you have to go into something deciding that it isn't real and operate from that perspective. I'm fine with saying that I have no idea what this is and I can't explain it. I also won't say that I don't believe in ghosts because I don't really know what a ghost is supposed to be. I've always been into aliens and was really obsessed with them when I was younger too, but still never fully believed in them. I just kind of liked the idea of them. I'd never seen one or seen any real proof of one, despite poring over documentary and late-night History Channel binges. So, on the subject of all things paranormal, I guess you could say that I'm kind of like Fox Mulder, and I want to believe, but never really did. Anyway, needless to say, after the following series of events, my mind is a lot more open. Though, I won't pretend that I can tell you exactly what was going on. So, I'm like 21 years old and I'm working at Walmart at the time, and we had these steps that we would smoke on that were outside the tyre shop that led up to another parking lot for a different building. I went out to smoke one day and was by myself and sat at the top of the stairs. As I was smoking, I noticed a paper bag sitting kind of underneath one of the bushes that was there. I don't know why, but I looked in it. I was expecting to find some sort of empty beer bottle or something, but inside of the bag was a porcelain lamp. It wasn't particularly creepy looking, to be honest. It didn't have bleeding eyes or whatever. It just looked like something that would be on your grandma's shelf. It had a red ribbon around its neck and looked really new, and when I picked it up, there was a note underneath it in the bag that said, "Take me home, I'll be a good little bitch, I promise." No, really, that's what it said. It was written in red ink, and it kind of looked like female handwriting maybe. Really neat anyway. It was written on one piece of torn out standard notebook paper, and again, I know how stupid and cliche that note sounds, but that's actually what it said. So, of course, me being me, I bought the thing inside Walmart and stashed it under a register because I was totally going to take it home, obviously. I showed it to my friend who was working there and was kind of like, "Dude, look what I just found outside. And look at this note." And he was like, "You probably should not take that home." But of course, I was going to. I mean, I live for that kind of stuff. Anyway, as soon as I set it down, I realized that it was actually a music box because I jarred it enough that I guess I made it start playing. I looked at the bottom of it, and it had one of those metal twist pins that you kind of wind up and it plays a tune. So I turned it on, and honestly, it was the least intimidating melody that I'd ever heard. It wasn't creepy at all. I was actually getting legit disappointed too, because if you wanted to pull a prank on someone with some scary object, this thing was just doing it all wrong. I don't know what the melody was too. I'd never really heard it before, but it was in no way ominous. Fast forward to the end of the workday though. I get in my car, come home, and show my then girlfriend this item. She was into all the same weird stuff that I was, so she was equally excited about this weird find. We cleared a space on her dresser for it, and from then on we just referred to it as the lamb. And shit started going down immediately. Like, literally the next day. So, me and my ex didn't have the greatest relationship, and I spent most of my time in the living room. She hung out in the bedroom. I'd work until around 11 at night and get home and stay on my computer playing games until like 3 in the morning. Then once she was asleep, I'd go into the bedroom and I'd go to sleep too. This way, we didn't really spend that much time together, and we both quietly preferred it that way. The very next day, I'm sitting in the living room and I hear a rustling sound coming from the kitchen. I could see the entire kitchen from where my computer was, and I assumed that it was one of our 2 cats maybe messing with something. But both cats were actually on the floor staring at the kitchen, just as confused as I was. The sound seemed like it was coming from on top of the fridge, and it sounded like something was rustling around the cereal boxes and the bags of chips and such that were up there. I assumed at first that it was a mouse because we'd found a mouse in the house before, the first specimen I ever pickled myself actually, and went over to the kitchen to check for this mouse. I turned on the light, and as I walked into the kitchen, I heard what could only be described as the Grudge noise. I've only ever seen The Grudge once because it was one of the only films that ever actually really scared me. I'm not easily frightened and generally don't care much for horror movies, but something about that long frog croak sound of The Grudge really freaked me out when I was younger. The only similar thing that's ever really scared me, recently anyway, was the screaming bear in Annihilation. But anyway, I started walking toward the fridge and I'm totally hearing this Grudge noise. This is only impactful too because this is literally one of the only things I've ever really been afraid of, and it was coming directly from the top of the fridge where the rustling sound had been. I froze dead in place, and so did my cats. They didn't want to go anywhere near that thing either. I had no idea what to do. I was literally on the verge of passing out. So I tried to articulate this in my head, and I decided that the fridge must be broken, and that a fan or something in it must be making a grinding noise. I crammed that thought into my head, and I sat back down in my chair and put on my headphones. I did leave the light on though, I'll admit. Normally I would just sit in total darkness. In my head though, I was really trying to convince myself that the fridge was making that noise, but I was finding it harder and harder to do so. But I also was in panic mode, and I was like, what do movies and ghost shows and shit say? Don't acknowledge it exists, right? So I became the dad in the horror movie film, and I just said, "Fridge is broken," and went back to playing WoW while on the verge of jumping out of my own skin and using my headphones to drown out the noise. In fact, I actually sat there for way longer than I normally played WoW because I was genuinely terrified to either move or take my headphones off. I had this horrible thought in my head that as soon as I removed my headphones, I would hear the noise like right next to my ear and turn and would see some old woman with an empty face or some shit right next to me. And to be honest, I have no idea how long the noise went on for or when it stopped. I just literally sat there until sunrise. I never went to sleep, and I just used an Elvis playlist and chatting to my guildmates in WoW to distract me as best as I could. But I literally just sat there frozen in terror the entire night until the sun came up and my girlfriend woke up. She came into the living room at about 8 a.m. and was pissed off at me because I never went to bed. She complained that I played games too much, even though we both knew that she didn't want me around any more than I wanted to be around her. But our relationship issues aside, she was badgering me about being on the computer all night, and I just said I don't want to talk about it. And she kind of let it go. She softened up quite a bit though, looked a little bit confused, but I think that she could tell that I was freaked out. Then she proceeded to freak me the hell out even further. She showed me her arm and said that the cat scratched the hell out of me last night. And she indeed had what appeared to be a cat scratch down the length of her forearm. Problem was, she kept the bedroom door closed all night. And like I said, both of the cats were in the living room with me. I hadn't moved from that chair all night. In other words, no one let the cat in the bedroom. They were in the living room with me the entire night. In fact, when sunrise finally came, they were still almost in the exact same spot, staring at the kitchen that they had been when I went back to playing WoW. I didn't say anything about it though. I just said, "Oh dang," and felt like I was about to be sick. But since I hadn't slept, I called into work that day, even though in reality I just really wanted to leave. So I did an unusual thing, and me and my girlfriend went bowling for the day, then to a movie, and then we went to dinner, and I was clearly acting weird because we never really did anything together, and I was clearly trying to avoid the house. I actually asked if she wanted to go night fishing, and she finally asked me what the hell was going on. I didn't tell her though. I didn't want to really talk about it. She declined my generous offer to fish in the dark though, and we ended up just going home. We started our nightly ritual, she retired to the bedroom to watch TV, and I ended up staying in the living room. And that grudge noise started within an hour of me sitting down again. This time, as soon as it started, I willed my completely stiffened for your body to get up and walk down the hall to the bedroom. I left my computer running and WoW open and said I felt like watching TV. My girlfriend again remarked that I was acting weird, and I again declined to talk about it. I couldn't hear the grudge noise from the bedroom, which I was thankful for. I took some Benadryl and went to sleep when she did, which was hours before I normally went to sleep. The next day I went to work, and at around 9 p.m, she called me. I was the manager of the toys department and had a bit of a leeway in using my phone since no one really supervised me. So I answered, and she was on the phone freaking out. She was screaming into the phone, and I could hear knocking in the background and couldn't really make out what she was saying. Finally, I made out a sentence, and she was saying, "There's banging, someone's trying to get in through the walls." Well, I left work and I drove home and stayed on the phone with her the whole time, and at some point on my drive home, she left the house and started running down the street. I picked her up in her pajamas as I was driving back, and she said that someone was trying to break through the walls. She heard banging on the walls of the bedroom, and by this point, I was pretty fucking certain that I knew exactly what she was hearing, but I still didn't want to say anything about it. I wanted to calm her down, and I told her that it must just be squirrels. I said that I'd seen some squirrels going into a hole the side of the wall and was afraid that we might have them in our walls, in fact. This was entirely made up, but it actually did calm her down. She didn't know squirrels could live in your walls, and I convinced her that this was the case and told her that I'd call an exterminator in the morning and have them come out and check it. We went back to the house, much to my despair. My squirrel story had calmed her down, but that was very short-lived. Now, the way our house is set up, we had a bathroom that was connected to our bedroom, but not by a door, just by the wall. So you had to leave our bedroom and the bathroom was the next room on the right, which means that the bathroom wall and our bedroom wall were the same wall. So we get inside and she went to the bathroom and immediately started screaming again. I came into the bedroom to see what she was screaming at, and it looked like a tiger had been clawing at the bathroom wall. The one that connected to our wall, the wallpaper, and I mean, who wallpapers a bathroom anyway, was torn off about 6 feet high, and there were large gashes in the drywall beneath it. Reminder too, this is all like about 4 days into having this fucking lamb. But at this point, we just got in the car and I told her about the grudge noise. Her initial reaction was that we needed to get rid of the lamb, but something told me that I couldn't. She wanted to just donate it to a thrift shop or something, but I just had this weird sense of unease about doing it. I felt like we couldn't get rid of it like that, and I felt like someone had to know what it was and want to take it from us. I can't explain why I felt that way, but I just did. So we did what you would probably not expect, and we actually just, well, lived with it. Like, this went on every day. We even had rules about it. The first rule was we never talked about it in the house. We never even mentioned it. We pretended the lamb didn't exist. It was like that episode of Family Guy where they had a giant octopus living in the house and just no one wanted to talk about it. When we had to say something about it, we would always say, "Let's go for a drive," and we would know what it meant. The clawing at the bathroom wall, though, was getting deeper all the time. Eventually, there was a huge hole in the drywall, and it was actually starting to claw right through the drywall that was connected to our bedroom. And I don't know why, but that was when I really started to freak out. For about a year, too, we lived with everything, and we just ignored it and pretended it didn't happen. Every night, I sat with that grudge noise, things would fly off shelves, doors would slam, straight up paranormal activity bullshit every day. But one of the worst ones was one of the pickle specimen jars exploded. It was a bird that we had for a while, and the mason jar exploded on the mantel in the living room. Glass went everywhere, and it took hours to find it all. And the bird itself also completely exploded, sending body parts splattering around the living room. Quite honestly, it was just hell, and I had a few friends that I would tell about it every day when I came into work. Like, they'd ask for updates on what the lamb had been doing, and I'd tell them whatever freaky story we had for the previous day, because it was literally a daily occurrence at that point. But eventually it all came to a head, and we just couldn't ignore it anymore. My girlfriend was waking up with bruises and scratches almost every day, and it actually started to look like she was self-harming. She had a lot of piercings and tattoos, so she wasn't too troubled by the pain, but she didn't really enjoy having to wash blood out of sheets every day. And when it got too much was when I was sitting in the bathroom browsing on my phone, and I heard a female voice say, "Hey, come here." So I finished my business and walked into the bedroom and said, "Did you call me?" And she replied with, "I was really hoping that was you." This was about 6 months in, and this is when it started talking, like literally speaking. And it had a little girl's voice. I know, again, that's a bit cliche and stupid sounding, but it would occasionally speak and we could hear it. We obviously never responded to it. Everything that we read on the subject told us to never ever respond. We'd hear it at our door at night, saying things like, "Hey, can I come in please? Please let me in." Now, I know you've probably tuned this out and chalked this up to some kind of excessively long, poorly written creepypasta, but I can promise you that it isn't. Her whole family knew about it as well, and all my friends did too. Everyone knew about this thing, and when we had friends come over, they'd ask us about certain stuff the lamb had destroyed, like, "What's up with your bathroom wall?" and we'd just respond by shaking our heads in the end, and they got the message. Eventually no one came to our place anymore. Everyone said that it freaked them out to be there, and they were terrified just to walk in. Even her parents stopped coming over. Her mother wouldn't even drive down our street. But still though, we ignored it, as best as we could anyway. Until one night, when I'm sitting on my computer, and a voice right behind me says, "Hey." I thought it was my girlfriend, so without turning around I said, "Yeah, what's up?" And the voice responded, "Nothing." Then I realized that it wasn't her voice. I spun around, and nothing was there. But I knew then that I just broke the cardinal rule, and I had fucking talked to it. I just about shat a brick, grabbed my girlfriend and told her what I did while we drove around in the car. She proceeded to call me an idiot for an hour and asked what we were going to do now. And so I finally decided that it was time to Google local paranormal investigators. I contacted a local paranormal investigation agency and sent them an email with a more condensed version of everything that I just told you guys. They responded in a few hours and asked me to send them a picture of the land. And that was the first time since the day that we set it down that I'd ever really touched it. Also, I should note that it just didn't collect dust for some reason. But I put it in the middle of the kitchen table, grabbed my camera and took some pictures of it. I sent the pictures away in an email and then nothing. Until this point, these people had been responding to me in a matter of hours, and now suddenly a whole day had gone by. Then 2 days, and in those 2 days, everything had escalated tenfold. What I mean is that the house was never quiet now. The garage noise could be heard outside of the home, and it just never stopped. Half the electronics didn't work, the TV barely worked, it would flicker on and off all the time, the power would go on and off, the taps would start running and then close, and the garbage disposal would turn on, the doors were slamming and opening non-stop. It was completely out of control, and we just couldn't even stay in the house anymore. Mind you, I wasn't rich. I'm living on a Walmart salary here, but we did get a hotel room. And I brought a laptop and I emailed the paranormal investigators again. And they replied to me this time and told me that the lady who answers the emails, who was also like their medium or whatever, and that when I sent her the pictures, she locked herself in her house and has refused to come out for the past 2 days. They told me that they were very sorry, but whatever I had was out of their league. So, great, right? My house is possessed and now it's gone apeshit because I talked to it, and the paranormal investigators don't even want to fuck with it. I actually contemplated calling a priest or something, but I'm not religious and I didn't know if I would have to have faith in the Lord or something or whatever for it to work. So I contacted another paranormal investigation company in the area and sent them the same pics and basically begged them for help. And this time, they actually responded and were helpful, and they drove down from about 2 hours away to help us. When they showed up at our house, nothing was happening. The doors were all closed, no sounds, nothing. And then they busted out all of these gadgets that I'm not going to pretend that I knew what they did or why they were there for. Some had lights though, and some made beeps, and some buzzed. One made little lasers all over the house, and they had recorders, microphone equipment. They saged the house, walked around waggling electronics at various locations, and I don't know exactly what the hell they were doing, but I at least appreciated that they seemed to be trying. The strange thing though is that they weren't getting anything. Nothing was happening. I even recorded bits of it on my camera. And then, all of a sudden, stuff did happen. My camera quit working just out of nowhere. The battery just literally KO'd. All of their noisy equipment started making noise, and there were 3 people, and they started talking to it like, "If you're here, give me a sign." And then they asked for it to knock on stuff, and this all went on for like 2 hours. Eventually they wrapped up, and the woman who was with them said that she believed the thing inhabiting our land wasn't a spirit. She said that it wasn't ever a person, and it was something else. She said that it was pretending to be a little girl to try and trick us, and the fact that we weren't being tricked was angering it. They left and told me that she'll call the next day, and she said that she knew someone who might be willing to take it. I couldn't fathom who would want this thing, but My girlfriend and I spent the night in the hotel again, and I did intend to get a call from the woman the next day. She said that she had spoken with someone named John Zaffis and that he was excited and wanted the item. I didn't know who that was at the time. She told me that he was the haunted collector, but that meant nothing to me. They said that he had a paranormal museum or something, but eventually they came back to the house, got the lamb, and mailed the thing off to him. Later I realized that this dude had an entire TV show and was the nephew of Ed and Lorraine Warren. And that was basically the end. Once this Zaffis dude had agreed to take it, everything just completely stopped. We never had another weird incident again. I never did fix the bathroom wall though, and we moved out when we split up and left it like that for the people we sold the house to. I wonder what they thought of it. But anyway, on a side note, I recently, the last 6 months, watched the Conjuring movies. In a very short scene in, I believe, The Conjuring 2, there's a shot where the Warren's daughter is sleeping in her bed, and on her nightstand is an identical lamb to the one that I had, and when I saw it, I almost started crying in horror. The one in the film has a blue bow around its neck, and the one that I had I'm pretty sure was red. The one in the film also doesn't appear to be a music box. But before anyone asks, yes, I do still actually have pictures of it that I've sent to the original paranormal team, but unless you really, really want them, I would rather not even touch the memory card that contains them. This story happened to me about 12 years ago. I was around 24 at the time, and I worked hospitality, so it'd be later at night when my friends and I would hang out. At around 9 o'clock, my friend and I decided to go for a drive, someplace we'd never been, just to sort of get in the car and go sort of thing. I offered and wanted to drive because my mother was out of town and I was using her Mercedes. It was one of those early 90s E-bodies, the ones that were big piles of heavy steel, a real tank of a car. I only mention the car body because it becomes pretty relevant in the story. He happily agreed though, and so we hit the road. Now, we lived near Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. Good old Wisconsin, where you get a lot of really good stories out of, I've noticed. It seems to be a pretty paranormal state, but either way, we drove north out of the city and drove for about an hour when I see an exit that I don't recognize and decided to get off there. There was really nothing at this exit other than cornfields. No gas station or restaurant signs, no visible light of a town in any direction, so we were in a place that we didn't recognize. But that was the point. Just driving to get nowhere because the speed limit was 35 and we were in no rush. The moon was out enough that everything was pretty visible. About a mile into the cornfields, we could see 2 kids on the right side of the road. We comment on just how weird that was because there was no housing or stores or even lights on the horizon. Plus, it was 10:30 at night. Naturally, too, we were 2 larger guys, so we don't worry too much about anything. I slowed down so we can inquire if their car had broken down or if they were okay. As we pulled up, I noticed the kid in front's clothing. It was a stained cream-coloured tweed-type shirt with real tattered sleeves and overalls with only one strap. He appeared to be maybe 12 years old. The second kid was taller, wearing a red flannel-type shirt, with old-time-looking khaki pants. However, I could barely notice the taller kid standing further behind the smaller one because, as I pulled up noticing the clothes, I got to see the whole child fully, and his arms were to his side, slightly raised, almost in that sort of iconic zombie way. But his eyes is what really stopped me. I couldn't take my eyes off of his, and I did my best to mutter to my friend, "You're seeing this too, right?" Because his eyes were pitch black. Blacker than the night, in fact, but easy to see as he just sort of stood there staring at us. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I've never been so frightened in my life, and I've had several odd experiences that have left me unable to deny that there is more in this world than what we can understand. So, we're stopped there for a moment, locking eyes with whatever these things are, and I can assure you that it wasn't a normal child. There was something off about them, and I have zero doubts about that. We quickly agree to go and fast. We decide in the end that we're not going to inquire with them. This was straight out of the Twilight Zone, and I remember the hitchhiker, and that was not happening tonight. No way. So we go and we clamor between ourselves. What the heck just happened? What did we just see, and what was that? Still no signs of homes, mind you, just open cornfields. How these two kids could be there, I have no idea, but I don't believe that those were kids. So I keep driving, and we get out of the fields into a wooded, windy road shortly after probably around 5 minutes. Here in Wisconsin, there are random historical markers displaying in whatever year this happened information sort of thing. I only mention that because I passed one on the curve, so I glanced at that. And as I'm driving through a curve going about 45 miles per hour, what I can only describe as a creature walks in front of my car, my mum's car, and as I saw it, it was nothing like I've ever seen before. Its spine was sort of elongated and tall. It stuck above the hood ornament as I hit it as well. It was grey colour and looked nothing like I'd ever seen. It had a very tall arch in its spine, almost like when a cat hisses and goes on its toes, that kind of shape, but in a very sort of tall, gangly creature. And I hit this thing straight on with the tank that is the Benz. My friend is freaked out at this point, as I am too, to say the least. I stop immediately, but now we're both a bit scared from the children of the corn just walking around out there, and then this thing literally within minutes of one another. So we decided that getting out is not going to happen. But I decided to stay in the locked car, use the car and its lights to see what we hit and make sure whatever the heck it was is dead, and I needed to know what I just saw as well. So I drive in tiny circles, backing up and forwards, looking for this creature, but after checking every inch within 100 yards and not seeing a thing, including not a drop of blood where I hit it, straight on with a Benz, mind you, and making contact with its spine as well, body and head too, there was just nothing. That was unnerving, and although I wanted to check my mother's car, that would be dealt with further down the road for sure. But we were not going to get out here, so we decided to just head home at this point. 15 minutes later, before I got back to the freeway, and I needed to get out and see how bad the car was, as I got out to check, quickly too, as I wasn't taking any chances tonight, I noticed that my grill was busted in, but nothing too bad. So I made sure that it was secure, and I got back in as quickly as possible. My friend decided to stay in the car, like a big chicken. But recently, I actually heard of the black-eyed kids, and it really freaked me out a bit. I didn't know that they were a real thing, and I definitely didn't know about them at the time. I thought that I just saw a couple of demon kids, or ghosts, or I didn't know what to think at the time. To this day, I've looked through tons of photos of supposed cryptid beasts and mythological creatures, looking for what I hit, and the closest I've found is probably something akin to a Wendigo, and they were very close to what I believe I saw and hit that night. It seems very odd, though, that both things could happen so close to one another, or even be related like that. Or perhaps they're not related. I don't know. It was possibly an evil area, or a ley line, or something. I don't know, I'm just guessing. I would like to point out, though, that I've lived in Wisconsin a long time, and it was not a deer or coyote or anything else. But what I hit was nothing native to the known Wisconsin landscape, that much is for sure. And neither were those horrid kids as well. For as long as I live, though, I'll never forget either of those faces, and I just hope that I never come across anything like that again. So, a few years ago, my boyfriend's dad's family decided to get together and all chip in to rent a condo in Ontario. But there was a big, extended family over there that his dad never saw, because he only really got along with one of the three sisters. My boyfriend's mum had talked him into going, though, and they let me tag along because, well, I'd been around long enough that they liked me and they trusted me. I can't remember where everyone else had gone. I think it was to the beach for what was probably like the third time that day. So it was just me and my boyfriend at the condo, because we were kind of sick of the beach and just wanted to do nothing in the shade for a while. We were sitting outside, looking over the water and just kind of talking about stuff and life. I just finished reading the Harry Potter series, so we were just kind of talking about that for a bit when this woman comes out of the brush beside the condo. Just for an idea as well, this condo was on about roughly an acre of land, and it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. The front of the condo was probably 70 feet from a dirt road that no one really travelled down, and there were some dense trees and some brush and whatnot that surrounded three sides of it. But this woman comes out of the wooded area, and I immediately knew that something wasn't right. She was limping, and she only had on one sandal, and frankly, she looked terrible. She was pale, and her face was gaunt. She was really, really pretty, but she just looked exhausted. The thing that immediately caught my attention was her baby, though, who she was holding pretty tightly in her arms as she started to come towards us. I didn't really know what to do, but my boyfriend got up and walked over to make sure that she was okay. I really couldn't help but think all of these awful things might happen after spending so many hours hearing the horror stories here. I was just terrified that she might do something. My boy is a lot more trusting than I am, though, and he's always had the first instinct of what's the problem and how can I help sort of thing. He's never assumed the bad in pretty much anyone. So this woman is just sobbing by the time that she gets to the porch of the condo, and she looks like she must have been through a war zone. She's shaking and hyperventilating and crying, and she's telling us that basically her boyfriend has been a drunk for a while, and he's been getting worse and worse, and he's been an overall abusive guy. He'd get really angry when she was focusing on the baby instead of him, and a part of what angered him was that it wasn't his kid, so he kind of didn't care about the baby at all. She told us how this time in particular he was drunk and she was driving him home, and the baby is in the back seat, and he grabbed the baby's booster seat and tore it out of the car and threw it out the window while they were driving. Apparently she got the baby out of the seat or something, though, and I didn't really remember how, because she was telling us about how he started hitting her before she took the baby and ran. But as we do, we hear this yelling, and we turn to see this angry dude walking up to the condo, and she starts losing it. Drunk and angry, this guy followed her to our condo and was starting to come up to us. He was trying to act like he wasn't angry. He was doing the, "Oh, you guys found her, thank you so much, baby, let's go home," kind of thing. But he was slurring his speech and not doing a good job of hiding just how angry he was. My boy has always been a bit of a pacifist. Honestly, he's even kind of a pushover. He's really non-confrontational and tries to find a way to talk stuff out and come to an agreement before doing anything. But before I could even say a thing, he's across the yard and approaching this guy. As much of a pacifist as he is also huge. He's honestly built like a footballer. He's 6'3", and at the time of this incident, he was 230 pounds. I've known him since we were 10, and at the time we were 20, and we'd been dating for just over a year at this stage. I would say that I knew him better than anyone. He's never done anything like this before, but he just goes up to this guy and goes, "Not another step, dude." And he's shaking as he says it. The guy tries to walk around and goes, "No, it's okay. I'm just going to take her home." And my boy steps in front of him and shakes his head and said, "You're drunk, so I'm going to pretend like maybe you didn't get what I just said. Don't come any closer." It's at this point the guy stops trying to pretend, and he says something like, "Listen, man, you don't know what's going on. That's my girlfriend. I'm going to take her home." And he tries rounding my boyfriend again, and one more time, my boyfriend blocks him and goes, "Stop." Now, I've never heard this tone in his voice before or since then. It was scary. It wasn't him. The guy tried one more time before my boy finally put his hand on his chest and pushed him back a bit, keeping his hand on the guy's chest. "I'm telling you right now, man, you're not going anywhere near that girl and her kid, so turn around and walk away." This guy was about 5'6", maybe 5'7", so when he looked up to threaten my boyfriend, he looked like a kid. The guy finally looks up at my boyfriend and he says something that I couldn't hear. My boyfriend said something back, and then the guy stared at him for a moment like he was deciding whether or not to do anything. My boyfriend finally pushed him away, and the guy stumbled back and then started pointing at me and the girl as he was saying something, and then he started to walk away. I didn't learn until the next day, but the guy had apparently said that he had a gun and that he was coming back and that he'd kill him if we ever stopped him again. The woman was sobbing, obviously. The baby was crying and I was shaking because even though he didn't throw any punches or anything, I could tell that he was ready to hurt this guy if anything else had happened. We called the police and didn't really do much of anything outside of make sure everyone was breathing and take the girl to her sister's place. We didn't really hear much from her after that, but I know that my boyfriend sent her an email once or twice, and she's apparently married now to somebody else, and had another kid last time they talked. In the end, it was actually quite a nice trip if I'm being honest. Despite that part, of course. I live in Colorado, and the Rocky Mountain National Park is pretty close to me. I'm pretty outdoorsy, and so I tend to walk and hike all over my beautiful state. Usually just do day trips or 24-hour stays outdoors, stuff like that. Quick campfires and small meals. Me and my dog mostly. So I was hiking just last fall in Grand Lake, a trail called Tonahutu Creek. It was about 1:45 in the afternoon. A dog wasn't with me at the time because they're not allowed on these trails, so it was just me and myself. I was walking southeast when suddenly the area went completely silent. No wind, no animals, not even the smell of the outdoors. It's like I sort of walked into a bubble where nothing existed or where everything was muted. I took out my phone to check the time and it was just after 3:45. Though it seemed like there was a weird fog around me as well. I kept walking, the silence still there, the odd feeling too. I walked for another good 10-15 minutes when I turned my attention to the sky, and the clouds seemed to be moving rapidly as if a storm was coming. The forecast didn't call for any rain or snow that day, so it was odd to see low-hanging clouds that were moving so rapidly, almost as if I was viewing a time-lapse of a video. But then I heard a rumble that came from the ground. It was emanating from what I assume was deep below. Sort of a large crack that sounded like thunder ended the rumble. The clouds stopped moving quickly, but had a very light pink or purple tinge to them. At this point, I was speed walking, trying to get out of there. My fight or flight response seemed to have kicked in, and my adrenaline was now pumping. The odd feeling to my gut turned to complete terror, and yet there was nothing around me that should invoke that sort of fear. There was no wildlife, no bears, no mountain lions. Then, another crack and a flash of light later, everything just seemed to go back to normal. The wind returned, the birds that filled the air with sound was now replaced with the sound of crickets, and the strangest thing was that it was now 6:30 p.m. I was already on my way back to the truck before this all happened, but it should not have taken me that long to get back to the trailhead like that. It only seemed like 15 minutes had passed, and yet more than 4 hours had elapsed. I have no recollection of what happened in that time either, besides what I've shared with you guys, obviously. I've only really shared this with a few people as well. Some said that I was abducted, others said that I entered a time slip or something, but truthfully, I have no idea what happened. Either way, though, I just wanted to share this to get it off my chest.
This is my dad's story from about 35 years ago. I will tell it from his perspective exactly as it was told to me. I grew up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, and when I was younger, my friends and I went camping pretty often, as it was something that we could do and drink and have fun being underage. When I was about 18, my friends and I decided one weekend to go camping near a lake called Small Fry. It's not too far from Portland, but far enough to get away. It was a pretty last-minute plan, so we didn't bring much other than some blankets and a case of beer my older brother bought for us. After school on Friday, we headed out, and once we got out there, we found a cleared out area that we could easily park our car in. At first, we made a small fire and drank a few beers, but we quickly got bored and decided that we would go out for a midnight swim. The area we parked in wasn't near an actual trail to the lake, but it was only about a half a mile away, and we knew what direction to go in. My 3 friends and I were pretty buzzed, as we were somewhat lightweights at that age. We decided to head out into the forest towards where the lake was. Now this was back in the 80s, so we didn't have cell phones with maps on them to double check. We trudged through the forest, completely sure that we were going the right way. I think it was about 15 minutes since we left the campsite, and suddenly the air around us changed. It was a warm, nearly summer night, and it was probably around 70 degrees. But as we kept walking, it felt like it was getting colder and colder. Suddenly I felt all the hairs on my body stick straight up, and the 4 of us all quickly turned around and ran back towards the campsite. We didn't talk, not even a word muttered to each other about turning back around. I've never ran that fast in my life. As bad as it sounds, my mindset in that moment was just I couldn't be the slowest, as I didn't want it to be my life ending that night. I can't explain why, but at that exact moment, we were all in that fight or flight mode, and we decided to run for our lives. I remember feeling as if there was a presence behind me. Not even a person, but just something. Something that wanted to harm us. We bolted back to the car, quickly unlocked it, and we all hopped in and drove straight home. We left the fire burning at the campsite, and all the clothes and blankets we brought with us were left as well. The car ride home was completely silent. We got back to my house. My friends got in their cars and left, and we never talked about that night since. A few weeks later, it was finally summer. My family went on yearly camping trips with a few other families that were close to us. One night, as a group of about 20 of us were sitting by the fire telling stories and just talking about life in general, someone from one of the other families brought up a weird hiking story they had recently experienced. He explained that he and his wife, along with a few of their friends, decided to go hiking on a Saturday. When they arrived, they were surprised to see that no one else was out there. It was a known hiking spot, so they figured that it would be pretty busy on a Saturday. The group of them hiked up the trail, and they soon got to the top of a cliff that overlooked a lake. When they got to the top, he felt as if he had no voice. The group of them quickly turned around and began to hike back down, walking much faster than normal. They didn't talk. They all just apparently decided that they did not want to stay, not even to take in the view. They had brought lunches with them, and all talked about taking some pictures too. Instead, they all hurried down the trail, not talking to each other at all. They all just had this gut feeling that they had to get out of there. None of them spoke to each other on the way home, and no one brought it up since. I asked where this hike took place, never mentioning that I had a similar experience. The man said that this all took place on Small Fry Lake. That honestly scared the crap out of me, as I had just had that same experience. I did not want to say anything though, as my parents were visibly concerned, and I didn't want them trying to tell me that I couldn't go camping in that area again. This might not be the scariest story, but I'm curious to know if anyone else has been to this area and had a similar experience. When I was talking to this man and his wife, they both said that they had this gut feeling that they were living the last few seconds of their lives. The man said he started to see his life flashing before his eyes as he hurried down the hill. I don't know what's going on at that lake and what made us all feel that way, but there's definitely something not right about that place. I've never believed in the supernatural, but after this, I feel as though that is the only explanation. All I know is that I will never be going back there ever again. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved up there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens. It's the same town that Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lewis and Clark was born in. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state, the way it's positioned on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us that are born in Michigan usually stay here, and no one ever travels to my neck of the woods. There's no real way to just pass by, and we're landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. With the exception of the large cities, the state is mostly covered by woodlands. I have a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none stranger than the one I'm about to tell. We lived on top of a hill, about a 30-minute drive to the nearest town. Our next-door neighbors were a good 10 miles away. It was quiet. Few, if any, vehicles ever came by the house. I developed a strange fear of vehicles coming up the hill. It seemed like you could hear them for miles. I mean, of course, there were others who lived on our road, but this wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts. We didn't even have names for our roads. They were all designated by numbers. When I got older, I wasn't too excited or afraid when vehicles would pass by. During the day, I knew most of the cars and trucks that our distant neighbors drove. When night came, well, that was a different story. I could see the headlights cutting through my bedroom window and light up my walls like some kind of ominous paint. It's a hard feeling to describe, but in my young mind, I felt that no one had any business driving down such a remote road at any point after dark. At the time, I was about 13. The year was 1996. Our family, amazingly, had just acquired internet. Anyone that's in their mid to late 30s knows how insane this time was. For whatever reason, at this time, my dad installed a glass sliding door on the wall near where the computer was. The computer used to be the hub of our home at the time, unlike nowadays where every family member has their own computer, plus a billion other gadgets in their pocket. So having the sliding door open up to the scenery of the countryside from the computer desk was actually pretty nice. I appreciated it for about 2 days, before one of the strangest things I've ever seen occurred. I was up late on a Saturday night on the computer, like usual. In those days, I was probably messing around in the Yahoo chat rooms, or maybe playing Myst. Then I heard it. I mostly felt it at first. The low rumbling of a truck engine, creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed by our house, and then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back like a freight train. Nothing good would come from a suspicious truck driving down our road at 1 o'clock in the morning. What I saw next has burned itself inside my head. I can still recall it as clear as day. The truck screeched to a stop. A man flung open the passenger side door and quickly hustled over to the driver's side. This was all taking place too far away for me to give a really good physical description, but I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He wore some kind of puffy vest, jeans, and one of those trucker-style caps. He grabbed the driver and dragged him out of the truck, then slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be shouting orders at the driver, motioning him to open the tailgate. When he did, I saw the driver turn to the bigger guy, as if he was hesitating out of fear. Even at a distance, I could see this clearly. The driver was unnerved, and his partner forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck. The panicked driver began to frantically dig where the passenger had pointed to. He dug for about 3 to 4 minutes, paused, then looked at the driver, and the two exchanged some words that I couldn't quite make out. The passenger then dragged something out of the bed of the truck. I can only describe it as a closed sleeping bag, with a body still inside. The passenger walked over to the shallow grave and tossed it in. The two men then made a poor attempt of covering the hole before they sped off. You may be asking, well, did you go out and see what they buried? And the answer is surely what you would expect. Of course I did. And that's the creepiest part of all. When I went out to the road the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I saw. There was even the tire tracks from the night before, but whatever they threw into that hole was gone. I looked to the opposite side of the burial and was horrified to see footprints in the dirt leading straight into the forest. I had no idea what to make of it. I've repressed this memory for so long and just wanted to pretend that it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I've never told anyone about this. I believe that bag they threw into the ground had someone in it, and they thought that person was dead. However, based on what I saw the next morning, they were wrong. You can chalk this all up to teenage imagination if you like, but I stand by what I say. There are some things in this world that you'll never be able to explain, and even if you could, chances are you wouldn't care much for the answer. My dad owned a small house for a brief amount of time. This particular house was not one that he lived in. He bought the place to renovate and resell it for profit. This house was on a dead-end street in the woods. It was a very private location, but the road had a history of people dumping things off and abandoning stolen vehicles. There was only 2 houses on the street. This house was often used by drifters. A neighbor told us that it was a drug house for a long time. A few months after my dad bought the house, he called me to ask if I would meet him there to help him unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did, and noticed that there was a car in front of the house. I decided to go investigate to see if there was anyone in the car. The car had a license plate on it, and I saw clothing piled up in the back seat. As I was walking around the car, I started to have this uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. I then heard someone moving around in the woods near the house. I went and stood at the edge of the woods for several minutes, watching and waiting. My dad arrived a few minutes later with his trailer. He got out of his truck and walked over to the car. I told him I had a feeling that whoever owned it was still close by, and that I heard someone walking around in the woods before he got there. He looked over to the car, just like I did. Then we both decided to walk through the woods to see if we can find someone. As we were walking, I got the feeling that we were being watched by someone. I remember telling my dad how creepy it would be if we actually found a dead body. He said that he had the same strange feeling that we weren't alone. The pathway we were on came to a dead end, so we turned back. The car was still there when we returned. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned car. After getting off the phone with the police, we went inside the house to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes. When we came back out, we noticed that the car was gone. Someone had to have been watching us while we were investigating, and decided to immediately take off when we went inside. The police never showed up that night, and we eventually left. Several weeks later, a dead body was discovered in the forest by the house. The person who found the body was a lady who was hiking through the area. There was a neighbor who told her about the body before she found it, but the neighbor had a reputation of being a mentally unstable drunk, and no one took him seriously. That was the rumor anyway. After the body was found, the police came out to do a report. One of the detectives took a statement from my dad. My dad said the detective acted strange and uninterested. I refused to believe that it was just a coincidence that we saw a parked car in that area, not long before that body was discovered. As far as my dad knows, they never followed up with the neighbor after the body was found. He had a conversation with him months after this happened, right before he sold off the house. The story gets even stranger. The hiker who found the corpse stated it looked like it hadn't been there for very long, meaning that it wasn't a rotting heap. She also noted that the head and hands had been removed. The police would later report that the body had been there for years. Something tells me that that isn't true. If the body had really been there for years, it would have been nothing but a pile of bones and rot. It just doesn't add up. It also makes me wonder what could have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of the car that day. This happened 2 years ago. and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us unload. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hi. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off of him. Our daughter, who to this day is way too friendly to strangers, hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but mainly paid more attention to unloading our stuff than chatting with our new neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go fuck off. Later that night, me and my husband were still going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza that I ordered, my husband opened the door, and there stood Ben. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could tell him to get lost, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, but now he was just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him, he got a bit pissed. He started yelling and screaming at my husband, and began pounding on the wall. This guy was unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived across the way from us at the time, and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that Ben is the resident pest, and suffered from mental issues, but overall, was harmless as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear on your first night in a new place. After that, life kind of fell into place, and we settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed. He would always ask me for cigarettes, and I kept telling him that I didn't smoke. My husband said that he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw Ben off a little, and at first, it worked, but Ben started to pester us during the day. On our days off, we would take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us, said that he was great with kids, and that we could trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just let my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot, said that he was making sure no one parked in it. He then tried to hug our daughter, and she screamed and clung on to me for dear life. I took her into the house while my husband finally snapped and really gave the guy an earful, telling him just to leave us the fuck alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter, and we have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter didn't want to go outside because the bad man would be out there and stare at her. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors told me that he and another neighbor saw Ben staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool, and they chased him off. They reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. Ben wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks, while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town because of work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play Saints Row 4 and relax after working an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. It was about 10 p.m. at this point. If anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was, Before I got to the door, the knob began to shake violently. Then I heard Ben screaming,
"Let me in! Open this goddamn door!"
The heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against the door. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone, the sharpest knife that we had from the kitchen, and hid in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, there would at least be some distance between us. I called 911, and they said that my other neighbors had called in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens stop and voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, and he even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, and even added in their own experiences. My sweet church lady neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on, and she even let me stay with her and her family for the night. But after what happened, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking that at any moment I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. It turns out Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it that the landlord was aware of it, but willingly overlooked it, as Ben's family would slip him extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. Makes me sick. Ben really did take meds, but had not been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops that our daughter was his, and that we kidnapped her, and that I was having an affair with him. Crazy, right? Last thing I heard, Ben was placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say that we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we checked all of our neighbors for red dots. My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and the temperature dropped into the negatives. Snow was falling in thick layers onto the ground. It was around 10 p.m. when my mother finished up her classes, and by then it was dark. Bear in mind, in China it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through this old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There was also no lampposts around, so it was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going. But she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar and knew her way back home. My mother had this feeling that someone was lurking in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But suddenly, she stopped, and as she did, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked, but she continued forward and pretended that she hadn't heard anything. She thought it might have been another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from walking faster. As she began to pick up her pace, the crunching snow behind her also began to speed up. My mother couldn't handle the fear any longer and started running, but the thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She also gave a quick look behind her. She was greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in. The man did not appear to be wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. However, that's not what scared my mom the most. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant stall. When she looked back, she was able to see that her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street. Luckily that night, there happened to be a young couple walking towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran to them and collapsed. My mom was in hysterics when they asked her what was wrong. She explained to them what happened, but by then, the stranger had vanished. The couple that she ran into was living in the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father. They accompanied her back home, and they told my grandfather where they found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her assailant was, and thankfully, she never had another encounter with him again. In the summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room. I was working on some schoolwork, and my brother and boyfriend were playing a video game in the next room. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so that I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered that I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph of my essay, I called my parents to let them know that I would be gone for a few minutes, but that I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes from my house, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the gas station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping gas into my car, an old beat-up pickup truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling my tank. Before I got back into my car, I decided to run into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I then walked inside and quickly picked out some items. Just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store, guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built.
Everybody get on the ground!
The first man shouted. The cashier and everyone else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair.
You, stand,
he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him, stomped his foot, or attempted to punch his face, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part, I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me. "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man shouted at the cashier.
"Hand over the cash, or you're gonna be scraping this bitch's brains off the wall."
I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer at the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew that he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun press against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and just started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was then thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter before I fell onto the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police. Within seconds, they were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor. "Are you alright, sir?" I weakly asked him, my stomach still hurting. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone alright?" a familiar voice asked. One of the cops, who was also very good friends with my father, had entered the store. "Just us two might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything, as other cops eventually came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out that a customer had sneaked into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher. "Do you need any medical attention?" the officer asked. I shook my head and cried, "I just want to go home." As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. And then it clicked in my head. That vehicle belonged to the two men. They had been scoping out the place, waiting for the right time to strike. And I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually we came to my neighborhood. My mom rushed out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me around his arms and held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was lying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew that he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again. A couple of years ago, there was reports of a woman being attacked in my area. This was shocking because my community had recently gotten rid of a bunch of drug dealers who operated in my neighborhood, and the gang activity connected to that had died down significantly. We were all looking forward to living in a clean, peaceful neighborhood for a while. No such luck. I lived in an apartment building and was about 17 at the time. The attack on the woman was brutal. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten unconscious. Over the next few months, this happened to at least a dozen other women. Not much details were released to the press. I'm guessing the victims were too frightened to speak publicly about their encounters. Luckily, they all survived. However, none of them were able to give an accurate description of the perpetrator, as the attacker would usually sneak up from behind, in the dark. All of them were attacked while they were walking home from work. This meant that the assailant most likely watched these women and became familiar with their routines before making his move. Everyone was on edge. You could even see it in the streets. Husbands and fathers would hurry their families indoors as soon as the sun started going down. Children were not allowed to play outside after dark, and it was winter at the time, so the sun went down rather early. As soon as it got dark, the streets were dead. One day, my grandmother came to visit us. My mother had come down with a bad case of the flu. My grandmother spent the day at our place, and I guess we all chatted for a bit too long. By the time she was ready to leave, it was completely dark outside, and it felt wrong to let my grandmother go out on her own. My mom obviously wasn't feeling well, so I, being the stupid brave teenager I was, said that I would walk with Grandma to the bus stop. I was 5'2", not the ideal bodyguard, but come on. Would any of you let your grandma walk the streets alone with a serial rapist on the loose? We got to the station just fine, and I waved my grandma goodbye as her bus departed. There was a crowd of people who had gotten off the bus before my grandma boarded. After the bus was out of sight, I suddenly felt like I was being watched, and I turned around quickly. As I did, I looked straight at a dark figure who was standing under a lamppost that was just down the street from the bus stop. I froze, shocked. The recent attacks had been in the back of my mind all night, and here I was, practically by myself, staring down a dark, creepy figure that was standing under a streetlight. I suddenly broke into a run and caught up with the small crowd of people that had gotten off the bus. I ran through the crowd and sprinted home, looking behind me every 5 seconds. I was in hysterics by the time I reached my apartment building. Now, hear me out, guys. I know that nothing technically happened to me, but I was scared out of my wits. So I figured that I would call the non-emergency number for the police, just to let them know that there was a suspicious man standing outside the bus stop. Couldn't hurt, right? A while after I reported it, an officer called me back. I gave them my number when I made my initial report. They were really looking for this guy, so they made it a point to follow up on any possible leads. They got the man's full description by reversing the footage from the bus stop's security camera, and his appearance was an exact match to what one of the victims had described. A couple of days later, I learned from a local news report that they arrested someone in connection with the attacks. On the night before I saw him at the bus stop, he had apparently almost killed a female beat cop who was patrolling around an area where one of the attacks had taken place. He attacked her from behind and nearly beat her to death with a crowbar. Luckily, the lady survived. But I think that was one of the reasons why the police were so hell-bent on catching him. I've learned one more thing since his arrest. He had apparently been there at the bus stop to look out for more potential victims. Thank God I called the police that night on purely a hunch. I like to think that I contributed to the arrest of a very dangerous man. Hopefully he spends the rest of his days behind bars, where animals like him belong. This happened when I was 9 years old in 1987. I grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts. It's a medium-sized town on the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a very well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom worked at the Congregational Church. I got dragged along with his wife to church every Sunday, whether I wanted to or not. The one saving grace of going to church with my dad's wife was the opportunity to go on the playground after Sunday school class and the standing offer of cake, which they had almost every Sunday. It was one Sunday in late November. I was dragged to church with my dad's wife. Afterwards, as usual, me and the rest of the kids from class poured into the churchyard to socialize and drop cake everywhere. Now, I don't really remember what prompted me to approach a girl named Abby. She was 2 years younger than me and a lot more popular. She was somebody that I barely knew and hardly ever spoke to. But still, something within me told me that I had to tell her something important. So I sought her out on the playground that morning. "Hey, Abby," I started, feeling driven by something I couldn't explain. "You have to grow your fingernails out, so if someone tries to hurt you, you can go right for their eyes." I was dead serious as I said this. She gave me a slightly confused look and said, "Okay, why?" I didn't have an answer to that, so I just kind of shrugged and told her, "Just do it, okay? Trust me." A week later, she, her younger brother, and their mom would be found dead, murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot and killed Abby's mother Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother William. He managed to hide from the police for at least 2 days, eventually being captured a half-hour away in the town of Ayer. When he was arrested, the police noticed scratches around his eyes. I cried when I found out that she and her family had been brutally murdered. I finally understood why I had to warn her, but still could not explain how I knew. Regardless, I view it as a failure on my part. I remember being incredibly distraught about it. No 9-year-old should have that kind of burden or guilt. I feel awful about what happened to Abby and her family, and I wish I could have done more to save her life. It took me years to mentally accept what happened. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing, but I was just too young to fully understand. My best friend is a social media influencer. Nothing big time, but with a big enough following to get free shit, and has gotten 2 sponsored trips. She works a full-time job, but does the Instagram thing on the side mostly because of the perks. She's not big enough to make a living off this yet. Anyway, this was her first trip. A small boutique hotel from Miami contacted her through Instagram and offered her an all-expenses-paid trip to Miami for Memorial Weekend in 2018, in exchange for her to be in the hotel and take pictures and do a couple of stories. She was told that she could bring a female friend with her, and everything would be covered. This was her first time doing this, so at the time, she really didn't know how it worked. They sent her a bogus contract for her to sign. It stated that she would be responsible for paying for her plane ticket to Miami, and that she would be reimbursed for it later. This was to prevent a no-show, meaning the influencer gets the ticket purchased by the hotel, and the influencer never shows up. It seemed reasonable. She invited me, instead of a female friend, because she was nervous about the whole thing. We figured it wouldn't be a big deal, and worst case scenario, they wouldn't want to pay for my plane ticket, and she said if that was the case she would just cover it for me. We were supposed to be picked up by the hotel at the airport, so the day comes and we arrive in Miami. There's a guy holding up a sign with her last name, and the sign had the hotel logo on it. We were greeted and escorted to a black SUV. Here's where things get weird. As soon as we get in the car, the driver is visibly upset. We thought he was talking to the guy who walked us over, but he was talking to my friend. He had a very thick accent and was wearing dark shades. He was telling my friend that she was not allowed to bring her boyfriend, referring to me, and said that it was supposed to be two girls. Hotel told me 2 girls. No 1 girl, 1 guy. 2 girls. He was demanding to see where the other girl was. We were speechless and confused. The guy who walked us to the car looked annoyed. He got in the passenger seat and started arguing with the driver in what sounded like Portuguese. He then turns back to us and asked us where the other girl was. My friend, who's very upset at this point, tells him that there is no other girl, and that she is the influencer from Instagram, and I was just a friend coming with her on the trip. The big guy in the passenger seat gets out, tosses our luggage out of the car, and says something like, "This is some fucking bullshit." He then gets back in the car and they take off. And that was it. We were in shock. Utter and complete shock. My friend immediately emails Melissa, who was the PR person she had been in contact with through email, but she got no response. We decided to take a cab and show up to the hotel. When we got there, that's when everything started to make sense. The hotel had been rebranded and had a completely different name. We showed them the Instagram account, and it was indeed the Instagram account of the old hotel, but not the new one. They claimed to never contact us. Whoever was in charge of the old Instagram account, or whoever got a hold of it, did. Mind you that this was a pretty well-known hotel, and the account had over 10,000 followers. It was real, but upon further inspection we realized that the posts and pictures were really old. My friend felt like an idiot, and ended up breaking down. We called the police and met up with the detective. They investigated who was running the account before, or who had access to it, and nothing ever happened. It's upsetting and scary to know that whoever wanted to abduct my friend, or any other girls by using this old hotel Instagram, knows who my friend is. That account has since been deleted, and we never heard anything from anyone ever again. But to think that my friend could have been kidnapped had she gone with another girl instead of me sends chills down my spine. I've never had the best of luck with guys. I appear to have poor taste when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my kid's father after 5 years, I was ready to just be myself. About 3 months of being a single mother, my neighbor approached me stating that a friend of his, Steve, would like to meet me. It didn't take long before he charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing, but he began to drink more and more, and each time he would get extremely agitated. He would start fights with random people, and even some of our friends. Slowly, our friends would stop coming around, knowing how Steve got when he drank. This, however, did not stop him from drinking. But now all the anger was aimed at me. It took roughly 6 to 8 months of buildup, from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. Suddenly this became a very abusive relationship. One time I escaped out of the bathroom window. He later found me by beating up a friend of mine until he told him where I was. Steve began stripping all of my clothes off in a drunken rage while laughing at me and challenging me to go ahead and try to escape while I was naked. The last night of abuse was by far the worst. Before Steve started drinking that night, I told him that my son, 3 years old, was not feeling very well, and I was going to stay with him as he fell asleep. My plan was to spend the night with my son. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door open. I lied there pretending to be asleep. Several seconds went by. I held my breath as tears began to form in my eyes. When I suddenly felt his hand on top of my head, he grabbed my hair and yanked me out of bed, whispering in my ear,
"I know you're avoiding me."
Once in the living room, he threw me on the floor, then accused me of trying to leave him and demanded to know why. Before I could answer, he angrily came to the conclusion that it was another man.
"I swear to God, if I catch you with another man, I'll kill you and him."
He was obviously more drunk than normal. He punched and kicked me a couple of times, and I fell to the floor. I started to crawl to my son's room, and he slowly came from behind me, asking,
"Where do you think you're going?"
He then walked in front of me, kneeled down, and said,
"You stay right there or I'm gonna hurt you real bad."
He then sat on the couch and watched me as I sobbed on the floor. After about 30 minutes, it appeared that he passed out on the couch. I decided that this was my chance to escape. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and slowly crept by him. He suddenly woke up and grabbed my leg and said,
"Where are you going?"
I stammered out that I was going into the kitchen with my son to get him a drink. He then angrily replied,
"Hurry up."
As soon as I entered the kitchen, I ran out of the front door with no pants on, no shoes, and no purse. I carried my son all the way to the police station, which was thankfully only a few blocks away. After hours, the way the police station is set up is that you go into a room and press a button and talk to someone on the intercom. I ran in and put my back to the wall and pushed the button behind me as I slowly slid down into a sitting position while holding on to my son, waiting for Steve to burst through the door at any second. I remembered thinking if I was going to be beaten, at least it would be on camera. On the speaker I heard, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't even get a word out of my mouth. I didn't know how to explain. 2 officers came out to assist me. A female officer took my son and got him some food, and I went with the male officer to make a report, and he gave me a blanket. After 15 minutes, I heard Steve screaming my name as they brought him down the hallway. I held my breath as if he knew I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, an officer came back with a sergeant. At first, I thought they were going to tell me to go back home and gather my belongings while Steve was being held in custody. Instead, they asked me more questions about his anger issues and if there had been any previous fights. I explained to them Steve's alcohol problem and how he had become increasingly more abusive. They then showed me a list in Steve's handwriting detailing how he would dismember my body in a good spot where I would be buried without being found. He also had possible dates written down, with past dates crossed out. I couldn't breathe when I read this, and by this point tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the cop and asked, "What does this mean?" He looked back at me and said, "It means you're lucky." Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I left back home to Arizona before the trial started, but gave a detailed statement before I left. Steve, of course, pled not guilty, but in the end, he received 2 years in prison. Just before I left for Arizona, I received a letter from Steve. It simply read,
"It's not over. You'll always be mine."
I'm a female, and I'm 27. At the time of this story, I was only 19. I was living in Littleton, which is a suburb of Denver. I lived and worked in the same block, working at a hair salon, and lived in an apartment that was across the street. I lived with 4 other people in a studio apartment. Yes, it was chaos. But I was young and dumb, and I worked so much that I was only ever there to sleep. While working at the salon, I met people from all walks of life. Most were nice and hardworking like myself. In the plaza where the salon was located, there happened to be an abundance of loiterers, homeless drunks mostly. There was a particular man who I would often see. He always smelled like booze, but was nice enough. He was quite the flirt, which was a bit uncomfortable for 19-year-old me. On several occasions, he asked me to come hang out and drink with him. I always declined, telling him that I had a boyfriend. For the life of me, I cannot remember this man's name, so for the sake of the story, I will call him Mark. One afternoon, after getting off work around 4, I began to make my way across the parking lot to the coffee shop. I ordered my drink and took it outside to sit and enjoy the sunny weather. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark approaching me rapidly. A broad smile was on his face. He came up to me and asked me for a lighter. Begrudgingly, I obliged, passing it over. Mark lit up a cigarette and returned the lighter to me, as he not so gracefully brushes my arm. A disgusting chill ran up my spine. I pulled away and suddenly stood up, saying that it was time for me to go. Mark then begged me to come drink with him, and again, I refused. After that, I didn't see him for several weeks. It was a bliss, since he was always lurking around the plaza, waiting for some sorry soul to look his way. One night, I decided to go for a night stroll. I enjoyed night walks around this time of year because of the weather. I would walk around downtown Littleton and loop back to my apartment complex. I was maybe 10 minutes away from my home when a figure appeared in the walkway ahead of me. I thought it was nothing at first, since a lot of people were out and about. But when I got a closer look, I could recognize that it was Mark. He was swaying this way and that on the sidewalk, nearly falling into the road. This is where I made my first mistake. I should have crossed the road or turned around. Instead, I decided to walk past him, hoping that he wouldn't recognize me in his intoxicated state. But unfortunately, he did. Mark got in my way and stopped, smiling that broad smile once again. I sighed, resigning to my fate of having to walk with him. I asked him how he had been, and if he was having a good day. He said he was, but it would be a whole lot better if he had someone to drink with. I said that I couldn't, because I had to work early the next morning. Unfortunately, he was unbothered and continued to beg, trying the drunk puppy dog eyes on me. I was slightly uneasy, but otherwise unmoved. Awkwardly laughing, I tried to edge my way around him, but he held out his arms, blocking my path. With a serious face, I demanded Mark move out of my way so I could return home. For some reason, this flipped a switch within him. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, holding it tightly. I winced and I tried to shake him off, but Mark wouldn't let go. He took another step towards me and grabbed my other arm. Immediately, I knew it was going to bruise. The pain sent me into fight or flight, and I picked both. First, I shoved Mark as hard as I could into a bush that was behind him, and then I started sprinting down the sidewalk. I didn't stop until I burst through my apartment door. I dissolved into tears and fell on the floor. Alarmed, my roommates comforted me and started asking me questions about what happened. After I pulled my shit together, I told them what Mark did. By this time, my boyfriend was in the apartment and was furious upon hearing this. He stormed out of the apartment with a bat in his hand. Another roommate stayed with me. When my boyfriend returned, he said that he couldn't find him. We thought about calling the cops, but rejected the idea because we weren't exactly on the right side of the law ourselves. Marijuana wasn't legal yet in Colorado. So instead, I decided to buy some pepper spray and start carrying a knife on my person. It made me feel much safer. and I stopped going for walks after dark, unless my boyfriend went with me. Strangely, I never saw Mark again after that night, though I was completely okay with it. So wherever you may have gone, Mark, just leave me alone. Next time, I'll poke a hole in you. I'm writing this after a lot of contemplating whether I should or not, but I've decided that people should hear my story to be more aware. It's been 6 years since this happened, and as I'm writing this, I still get paranoid just thinking about it. I'm going to be pretty vague with the details. To this day, I'm still frightened. I'm a 23-year-old female, but at the time of this story I had just turned 17. I was working as a waitress. After a while of working at this restaurant, this guy was hired on as a cook. We'll call him John. John seemed pretty harmless at first. I was, and still am, a very nice person, and I try not to be rude to anyone unless they give me a reason to be. And even then, I try my best to avoid confrontation. Everyone at work was pretty friendly, and we would often joke around and prank each other. Eventually, John joined in on the work shenanigans. I should note, I never flirted or showed any romantic interest in this man, and when we joked around, it was always in a group. It was never just me and him alone. One night at work, after closing, I went outside to smoke, and John was out there as well. We started making small talk about work, and then we got on the subject of tickets and fines that we had to pay. I told him about a speeding ticket I had gotten a couple of weeks before, and I had no idea how I was going to pay for it, due to me not making enough with the hours I was working, and because I was still attending high school, I didn't have the time to work more hours. Now fast forward a few weeks. During this time we chatted and made small talk, but again I will say that I never flirted with him or showed any romantic interest. It was Valentine's Day. We were slammed with customers, and I was on the register trying to cash out a long line. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw John just standing there, doing nothing but staring at me. Employees had to use the register to clock in and out, so naturally I thought he was clocking out, so I told him to give me a second, and I would let him slide in and clock out. Soon I finished up with the last customer, and motioned for John to step up and use the computer. All of a sudden he hands me a giant box of chocolates, and says, "Happy Valentine's." He then clocks out and leaves. I just stood there in confusion. Earlier that night I had been bitching to a friend of mine about how my boyfriend wouldn't even give me a card for the holiday, and now I'm just standing here with a large box of chocolates. What just happened? Why did he get me something? Did he overhear my conversation from earlier and felt bad for me? Or did he really have a thing for me? Very soon, I would have the answer to that question. I brushed off the incident, and after that night, I didn't see him again for about a week, due to him working the morning shift and me working the evening shift. One day I had to go to work right after school, and I decided just to do my hair and makeup in my car in the parking lot, right before I went in. As I'm finishing up, I saw a car pull in next to mine. Soon after, I heard someone shouting my name. I look over, and guess who? It was John. He looked excited and told me to come over. I got out of my car and made my way over to the passenger side. With the window down, I asked, "Hey John, what's up?" He then told me to get in. So what did the stupid teenage girl do? She got in the 30-year-old's car. I sat there nervously, palms sweating, heart racing. He pulled out a rose. It was one of those artificial ones that you find at gas stations. And then he pulled out a wad of cash. It was like one of those drug deal scenes you see in movies. He shoved the wad into my hand and told me that was for me. I just sat there with my mouth open. Feeling the money in my hand made it almost feel like I was holding something heavy. I struggled to find words, and it was even harder making the choice if I should take it or not. I mean, what teenager doesn't want a roll of cash? But I knew that if I took it, there would be strings attached. I felt like I sat there for an eternity, but it was only about 5 seconds, and then I asked him, "What's this for, John?" He then replied, "It's for your speeding ticket. I've been in a lot of trouble with the law before, and I don't want to see anything happen to you." The next thought that popped into my head was, what did I have to do for this money? And I didn't like the answer I came up with. I sat there for a few more moments, until morals and common sense took a firm hold of my mind. I laid the cash on his dash and said, "Look, I appreciate the offer. I really do, but I can't accept it. It's your money, and it's my screw-up, so I should pay for it." After that, I hopped out and went inside and clocked in. That night went pretty normal. Every so often, I would catch John giving me this sad look, and I sort of felt bad for him. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe he was just lonely and needed a friend. So after that, we hung outside of work a few times. Looking back, I'm aware that this wasn't the smartest choice, being a 17-year-old girl hanging out with a 30-year-old. John was acting really odd outside of work, like a person that just gives you really bad vibes in the pit of your stomach. He would make a few passes at me, and I would politely excuse myself. Eventually, I stopped hanging out with him altogether. I sent him a short but nice text saying that I wasn't interested in a relationship. But apparently, he wasn't going to accept that. He would send me endless text messages and would often call me trying to get me to hang out with him. Every time he was working the same shift I was, he would give me one of those gas station roses. I would cringe and accept it because, again, I was 17 and avoided confrontation at all costs. He was a 30-year-old man, and I was a teenage girl. I avoided him as much as possible. I even asked my boss for the working hours where John was off. Soon after, I started to ignore the texts. He eventually got fired for no call, no show. A month or two had passed, and I eventually quit myself. I had gotten a new number and switched phone companies. One night, as I was picking up my best friend from her boyfriend's, I was waiting in the car for her to come outside so we could go to my house. My phone then started to vibrate with multiple text message notifications. I picked up my phone and noticed that it was all from the same number. In total, there was 10 messages. I started to read and was so confused at first as to who was sending me their entire life story in a text so late at night. But as I started to gather the puzzle pieces, it suddenly clicked. It was John. I can't remember exactly what the messages said, but to sum it up, he was confessing his undying love for me, and didn't understand why I was ignoring him, and why I had changed my number. I was so nauseous, I felt my stomach churning inside me on the spot. How the hell did he get my new number? At this point, my best friend had hopped in the car, but I didn't look up from my phone screen. She must have noticed how uneasy I looked after I didn't answer her. She leaned over and saw the phone in my hand. She took it from me and read the texts out loud, and then suggested that I call my mom. I knew that my mom would be angry with me if she found out that a grown man was contacting me. So I told her that that wasn't a good idea. Right then, I got a call from a different number. I answered, "Hello?" And then I heard slow, deep breathing. And then the line suddenly went dead. My best friend, who we'll call V, said, "You should block that number." To which I did. But over the next month, I still got random texts and calls from different numbers. I would never text back and blocked every single one. Some of the calls I did answer, and I would hear that same disturbing breathing before hanging up. Eventually, everything stopped altogether, after I ignored them for so long. Fast forward about 6 months, and every single aspect of my life had changed. I moved out of my mom's place, and got my own little rundown apartment right before I turned 18. I had a new boyfriend, who I'll call James, who also moved in with me. I switched schools, changed my number again, and got a new car due to the transmission on my old one going bad. I also had a new job at a medical facility in housekeeping. There was a lot of changes that I went through. James and I didn't feel comfortable getting mail at our place, due to some of the shady people in our area, so we got everything sent to my mom's house. Every Monday I would swing by my mom's, do some laundry and get my mail from the week before. So one day while I was over there, I had started some laundry and made myself comfortable on the couch, trying to enjoy my only day off from work that week. My mom walked in and tossed me my mail, and informed me that there was a written piece of mail addressed to me. This piqued my interest, because who writes letters anymore? So I skimmed through my mail, tossing the junk aside, and eventually found the letter that she had mentioned. It was a regular white envelope with my name on it. At this time, I had just turned 18, so once a year I would get birthday cards from a few out-of-state relatives, but over the years I learned to tell by the handwriting who it was, and I didn't recognize this handwriting at all. I looked at the return address, and to my surprise, it was the address of the restaurant I used to waitress at months prior. I thought to myself, maybe it was a check that I never picked up? But then again, I had gotten paid through direct deposit into a linked student account my mom set up for me, so that wouldn't make any sense. Maybe my old boss was trying to contact me? No, it couldn't be. He had my mom's number as an emergency contact, so if he needed to reach out to me, why wouldn't he just dial that number? I was dying of curiosity at this point, so I ripped open the letter, and as I read the first sentence, my blood ran cold, and I stood up straight off the couch as I felt a wave of panic run through my body. It was John. The letter was made up of 2 front and back pages. I felt so sick. How the hell did he get my mother's address? The letter stated that he missed me, loved me, and said that he hadn't felt this depressed since his mother died a few years back. He wrote that he wanted to be with me, and that he would give me whatever I wanted, a house, car, and even kids. This letter was a combination of desperate, delusional, and disturbing. I was only 18 years old. Did he honestly think that I wanted children? At the bottom of both of the pages, he left his contact info. But what scared me the most about this stupid little love letter is that there was no postage stamps. This guy had driven to my mom's house and put it directly in the mailbox himself. So now I'm standing there in tears, frozen in fear, as my mom walks up to me and asked me what was wrong. I didn't realize she was standing there the whole time, watching me read this letter, in fear that she would flip out if she knew the truth. I wiped my eyes and lied to her, and told her that it was an old friend from high school, informing me that another friend had passed. Thinking back on it now, it was pretty far-fetched, but she bought it, and I folded up the letter and shoved it in my pocket. I finished up my laundry and left. On my way home, I stopped at a gas station to fill up, and as I'm waiting for my car to be topped off, I pulled the letter out of my pocket and glanced over it one more time, before tearing it up into tiny pieces and throwing it into a trash can, hoping so desperately that that would be the end of it. During the drive home, I kept asking myself over and over, why me? Suddenly I realized that if he went through the trouble of dropping a handwritten letter off at my mom's house, what else was he capable of? I knew that somewhere deep in my gut, he was going to try and confront me if I didn't respond to that letter. I waited about a week to tell James, and when I did, he was extremely upset. First at John for pulling a stunt like this, and then at me for waiting so long to tell him. However, James came to the same conclusion that I did, and he bought me a baseball bat to keep in the trunk of my car and a bottle of mace to carry in my purse. Another 2 weeks went by. Things were pretty normal for the most part, so I pretty much forgot about John and the nerve-wracking situations that he would put me through, or at least I put the memories in the back of my mind. The weekday started off as normal. I woke up, got dressed, kissed James goodbye, and picked up some breakfast on my way to school, and attended classes as normal. Keep in mind that when John and I worked together, he was driving a blue car. So that was usually what I would keep an eye out for. I walked out of my school, got in my car, and pulled out of the parking lot. I was on my way to where I worked at the time. I had just hopped on the interstate and went down one exit and got off. My grandfather lived near my work, and I did have some time to go see him before I started my shift. So I'm stopped at a traffic light, and I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw a red car behind me with a man driving who had sunglasses on and his sun visor pulled down. But I could tell that this man looked like John. I thought to myself I was just being paranoid because John drove a blue car. I continued with my drive, but I noticed that this red car was riding my ass the entire way, making every turn and switching lanes whenever I did. When I turned onto the back road that led to my grandfather's place and saw the red car following me, and I realized that this was in fact John. And it was at this point that I started to panic. I floored it, trying to get him off my tail. So I made up the quickest plan that I could think of. Pull into the driveway and run inside to my grandfather and tell him what was going on. I pulled in and stopped, but before I could jump out and run inside, John was already out of his car, walking up to mine and shouting my name. At this point I was terrified and shaking. He gets to my car and pulls open the door, and is now blocking my path to the front door of the house. I looked up and saw the rage in his eyes. Everything happened so fast I can barely remember what was said. I do vaguely remember asking him why he was following me, and how did he know where to find me, assuming that he had followed me from my school, which meant that he sat in his car for God knows how long, waiting for me to get out. All he said in response was, "I need to talk to you." I refused, and told him that I was going to call the police. His response was, "I don't care. I just came here to see you." At this point, I bursted out of my car, taking John by surprise as I pushed past him. I flew up the steps and flung open the door and ran inside. I could have made the US Olympic team if they saw how fast I hauled ass. I was bawling my eyes out, scared out of my mind, shaking from adrenaline and shock. My grandfather was in the living room, asking me who was yelling outside, and the only words I could get out of my mouth was, "He followed me here." I turned around to see my great-uncle standing there with a shotgun in his hand. He then followed my grandfather outside. My grandfather confronted John in his driveway. "You see that road, boy?" He pointed. "You best get your ass on it now." I was standing on the porch next to my uncle, who had his arm over my shoulder, trying to comfort me, with a shotgun in his other hand. At that moment, I thanked God for my redneck family. John shot me this horrible look, as if to say, "This isn't over by a long shot," and then he sped off. My grandfather then told me that he was going to follow me home for the next few days. I also had co-workers walk with me to my car, and would have James greet me in the driveway every night. Fast forward about a month. By this point, paranoia was controlling my life. I couldn't go anywhere by myself. I deleted all my social media accounts, and would see a counselor at my school on a regular basis. I would even have the resource officer walk me to and from the parking lot. I was always looking over my shoulder with each step, and was still having coworkers walk me to my car every night. It's safe to assume that everybody at my work knew what was going on. After having off a Monday and returning to work on Tuesday as scheduled, I went outside to catch a quick smoke and joined the company of this older woman that I worked with. She was outside the smoking area, waiting for me with news that sent chills down my spine. Apparently, while I was off that Monday, a man came in looking for me. The staff knew that I was off and said they couldn't disclose any information about me. He told them okay and left. Fast forward to 3 in the morning, and a coworker of mine, who had a similar appearance to me, who was unaware that I was being stalked and harassed, had gotten off. when she noticed someone in a red car was following her. It followed her all the way to her home, and this poor girl lived over 30 miles away, in a different county, with her mother and 3 kids. So when she pulled into the driveway and noticed that the car was still behind her, she called her mother and told her to grab her gun and come outside. Her mother did as she said and exited the house, gun drawn. My coworker stepped out of her car and tried to get a look at the driver, but was blinded by his headlights. I'm guessing that this was when John realized that the girl was not me, and quickly drove out of there. After I heard this, I broke down crying and apologized over and over to that girl. I felt horrible. My problems were starting to affect other people. What if he had broken into her house, or worse? That thought scares me to this day. This was the last major incident with John. I actually did research on him a couple years later. However, I'm sad to say that it didn't turn out much. A lot of traffic tickets and a suspended driver's license. But other than that, nothing. Every so often I do try to keep tabs on him, because I refuse to be a victim again. I will say that he never threatened me, or physically harmed me in any way, but it's just the fact that he went to such great lengths to hunt me down, which in its own way is very unnerving. I have since moved again, gotten married, and very recently started a family. And I would say that I'm very happy that I've moved on with my life. But just the other night after returning home from a long shift, I noticed one of those artificial roses, the kind that you find in gas stations, laying on my front doorstep. This happened to me about 4 years ago. I'm 23 now, so I was 19 at the time that this took place. I was up late one night playing video games as I usually did on the weekends. I remember very clearly that it was storming that night. It was a pretty bad one too. The wind outside had to be up to around 50 miles per hour, and the rain was coming down hard. I was worried about my power possibly going out, as it was a common occurrence whenever it stormed. After a few hours of playing my game, I began to get hungry, so I made my way into the kitchen to make a snack. I live in a mobile home community, so each home sits pretty close to each other. As I was making a sandwich, I heard a few popping sounds from outside. At first, I just assumed that it was thunder, but then I heard a couple of more pops. I looked out the window that was next to the back door, which was facing the direction I had heard the noises from. I really couldn't see much, other than the dim light emanating from a nearby lamppost that overlooked the street behind my house. Thinking that it was just the storm, I finished up in the kitchen and shut off all the lights and went back to my gaming. After about 10 minutes, I could have sworn that I heard a noise coming from my front door. I had a motion light that would go off at even the slightest movement anywhere near my front porch, so I looked out of my bedroom window and I could see the glare of light coming from my front porch. Having heard the noise and seeing the light now, I knew that someone or something had triggered it. I was home alone, and I was getting a bit creeped out. I made my way through the dark house into the front door. The door had a diamond-shaped window at the center of it, and I crouched down to keep myself from view. I slowly lifted my head and peeked out, but nothing was there. I opened the door and stepped out into the rainy night, and still I saw nothing. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. As I was making my way back to my room, I could see the flashing of red and blue lights from a cop car coming through the window on my back door. I went over to the door and saw at least 3 cop cars sitting on the road. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could see 2 officers talking to someone who lived in one of the mobile homes on that street. I watched for a while until I got bored and went back into my room. It wasn't until the next day that I saw on the news something that scared me to my very core. The noises that I heard the night before turned out to be gunshots. According to the police, it was a drug deal that had gone wrong. 2 men had been gunned down, killed execution style. One man was shot in the head, and the other was shot a few times in the chest while sitting down in a chair. The police had reason to believe that this was gang-related. One of the men were identified after a family member reported him missing. The other victim was the owner of the mobile home, who had set up a meeting with the drug dealers. Needless to say, things went south fast. I came forward to the police after having seen the news reports. I am completely convinced that what I heard on my porch that night was the man who had just killed those 2 men trying to get into my home, as the police recall very soon after the shots were heard. I told the police this, and they also agreed that the killer was seeking a place to hide, and just happened to choose my home as there was no car outside, and he may have thought nobody was there. But once he heard me walking down the hall, he must have ran off into the night. I'm not sure what happened after this, or if the man was ever caught, because I never heard back from the police after giving my statement. It scares me to think what could have happened if that man chose to break open my door, or if I hadn't heard the noises coming from my porch. I very well could have been the next victim. I consider myself very lucky that I never encountered the killer that night. Always be safe. You never know who's out there in the dark.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
I was house sitting for my grandma one weekend while she went to Florida with some of her church friends. I was sleeping in the guest bedroom next to her room. The guest bedroom always had 2 twin beds inside of it that my brother and I would sleep in when we had sleepovers at her house. I took the bed next to the window, but before getting into bed, I checked all the doors making sure they were locked. When I did get into bed, it was early, and I didn't actually go to sleep for a while. There wasn't much to do at my grandma's house. I was just on my phone for an hour or 2, watching videos, texting people, whatever. That's when I thought I could start hearing someone's voice outside. It sounded like a woman's voice, saying hello. I left the bedroom and inched my way closer to the front door, moving slow because I was trying to listen.
Hello.
It was a woman's voice, just going hello like every 10 seconds. As I got closer to the front door, I realized that's where it seemed to be coming from. My grandma's door doesn't have a peephole, but the windows in her dining room gave a clear view of the front porch, so I went over to that window to attempt to get a view of who was out there. I tried peeking my head in between the plastic blinds without making it obvious, but I guess I didn't do a good job of that, because when I looked, I did see a woman on my grandma's stoop, and she was looking right at me, as if she knew I was going to be looking through those blinds. Once again, she said hello, with some freakish smile on her face. This woman was older, but don't picture her as some innocent-looking, small old lady. She looked like she was maybe late 50s, early 60s, and something about her face just skeeved me out. I moved away from the window and thought maybe it was one of my grandma's friends. It was midnight, though. Why would anyone come to the door this late? And why wouldn't she knock or ring the bell? Why was she just standing out there going hello over and over? I was genuinely unsettled. I just went back to the guest bedroom and shut the door. Now with the door shut as opposed to before, I couldn't hear that woman anymore. Maybe it was that, or she just decided to leave. I started texting everyone about it, my sisters, my friends, telling them how bizarre it was. But a good amount of time passed in silence, and I was starting to calm down. My sisters were telling me to call Grandma, but there was a 0% chance she was awake, and she barely ever even checked her cell phone anyway. Just like that, something broke the silence. A banging at the window. Not a knocking or tapping, banging. I felt that fierce pain in my chest area as my body entered that fight or flight mode. Shortly after the banging stopped, I heard that familiar voice say hello. With that boost of adrenaline, I guess I had the extra confidence to grab the blind and push it up. There I was, face to face with this horrifying older lady, with only a thin layer of glass between us. I screamed at her smiling, gross face, "I'm calling the cops." I pulled the blind back down and ran back outside to the living room. I looked around the house, then ran upstairs to box myself into the upstairs guest bedroom. I didn't want to actually call the cops. I don't know why. I wanted to just wait it out. I crawled into the bed in the upstairs guest bedroom and tucked myself under the covers. A couple hours later, I was still awake, and I finally only then went back downstairs to look outside each window. That freaky old lady seemed to be gone. The next morning, I called my grandma and told her what happened. She started yelling into the phone, clearly panicking and distressed. She told me how a few days earlier, she was being watched in the grocery store by some woman about 10 years younger than her, who just kept smiling at her for no reason. I told her to calm down. I didn't entirely know whether to correlate the two or not, but when we eventually got off the phone with each other, I did have to give it a second thought. My grandma is 75, and she has lost a bit of her wits, so I do have to take some of the things she says with a grain of salt. But the way she yelled into the phone about the woman in the store really gave me the chills, and I still wonder if it could have been the same person. My name is Nicholas. I'm currently a freshman at Syracuse University, which doesn't exactly sit in the safest area. I just went through a breakup with my first girlfriend, so I started getting back into the online dating scene. I was using the app Hinge when I found some blonde girl named Stephanie who I really connected with. She also went to Syracuse. We both liked to read, go to the movies, we even had the same sense of humor. I suggested we go on a movie date, and she said she'd love to. She told me to meet her at some specific point near campus and she'd pick me up. So, around 9 o'clock, I waited on some corner of a normal neighborhood block, waiting for Stephanie. She asked me to share my location with her, and so I did. A few minutes later, I saw a car turn down the street and start approaching me. Then it stopped in front of me, and the driver rolled down the window. It wasn't Stephanie, though, but some old random guy. He asked what I was doing alone out here, which was insanely weird, first of all. Then I said I was waiting for someone. He asked if I was waiting for Stephanie, and I said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" He said he was Stephanie's father, and told me to hop in so he could give me a ride to her. I took a good look at him, and he looked a little old to be her father, to be honest. I'm no idiot when it comes to sketchy situations, so I said in a firm voice, "Why didn't you tell me you'd be picking me up?" He claimed he didn't trust a random guy meeting up with his daughter, and wanted to meet me first. I took another good look at the man and didn't say anything. I simply started walking away in the opposite direction from where his car was facing. He started yelling, "Hey, hey," sounding surprised that I was just walking away like that, but I've heard way too many kidnapping stories to know where this could potentially go. I heard the guy's car moving, and I turned to make sure he wasn't doing a U-turn to follow me. I breathed a sigh of relief when he drove straight and turned left out of sight. I continued walking down the block towards campus. I got to the corner of the block and was just about to make a turn when I noticed what I was pretty sure to be the same car the man was driving, just parked on the side of the road with the light shut off. I briefly tried looking into the window as I passed, but the glass was tinted. I tried not making it obvious that I was suspicious and continued walking. I got a text from this so-called Stephanie person saying, "Why didn't you get in the car with my dad?" I ignored the text and continued walking. I kept looking back to see if the car would move. When I got to an intersection in the road, I turned right and then full-on booked it in the direction of campus. Surprisingly, I wasn't followed. I made it back to campus out of breath and started walking to my dorm building. I felt like I heard footsteps following me, though. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but when I heard a piece of broken glass being kicked by someone's shoe, I knew I was being tailed. I made a point of ducking down behind a van and stopping to give me time to listen for where their footsteps were coming. They were a few cars away from me. Then I remembered. I never stopped sharing my location with Stephanie, or should I say that man. I saw him. It was that old man. He was approaching from between two cars across from me. He yelled something that I didn't fully understand, but it sounded like he said, "Come back and I'll take you to her." He had to be like 60-something. There's no way he would catch me if I sprinted. I lost him easily when I ran, and made it back to my dorm room. My roommate wasn't there, so I had no one to talk to about it. But when I lay in my bed, I got another text from that man, and it was shocking. It said, "You're a little piece of fucking shit. You're lucky you got away. I would have strangled your ugly ass." I still have the screenshot. I replied saying thanks for the threat, it's going straight to the police, and I blocked his number. I still have the conversation saved as evidence, and I plan on going to the police with it eventually. Hopefully they are able to do something about it. When I was 18, I had a side job as a part-time janitor at my high school over the summer. I would work sometimes days and sometimes nights, anywhere from 9 a.m. to 12 a.m., depending on how much money I needed. Oftentimes I would be left to lock up the building when the older janitors have left. This was a time before the high school had cameras installed in every single hallway. So one night, one of my superiors, Tom, had to leave early, meaning I'd be finishing up the rest of my shift alone, and I'd be locking up for the night. He told me text him if I need anything, as he always did, and then he left. I loved it when I was left alone because usually I'd just do half an hour of work and then just hang around on my phone or leave early and still get paid for the whole shift. I definitely pushed it with the things I'd get away with at that place. One of the things Tom asked me to do before leaving was bring all the extra seats in the gymnasium from the assembly down to the basement storage room. So I figured I'd do that, then just go home. I grabbed a stack of 6 chairs and started carrying it down to the basement. The lights in the storage room were very dim. They kind of suck. The whole basement of that school wasn't exactly pretty. It felt more like a basement to a warehouse. Anyway, there were what appeared to be a bunch of art mannequins covered by paint cloths. You know, those big things that look like blankets. It seemed all of the school's art supplies were stored down here. I dropped a stack of chairs down where the rest of the chairs were stored, then went back up to the gym to get more. When I came back down with more chairs, I noticed one of the mannequins was exposed now. The blanket was removed from on top of it. I know for sure it was covered minutes earlier because it was one of the front ones. I texted Tom saying, "I think someone's down in the basement." He said back, "What do you mean?" And I said one of the art cloths were moved. He took a minute to respond saying no one else should be there. Then I noticed something. The art cloth, tucked in the corner of the storage room, sitting outside of the light that was produced at the center of the room. It was covering something, surely. I started to tiptoe over to it, but when I was a few feet away from it, I realized whatever was under that cloth was moving just ever so slightly. There was undoubtedly someone hiding under there. I ran back upstairs and locked the basement door. I texted Tom saying someone is hiding under a cloth in the basement. He said call the cops, but I insisted he just come back since he only just left like 10 minutes ago. He didn't want to come back though. He told me to be a man and confront whoever was down there. So I went down to the basement again. However, the cloth was now strewn flat on the floor, and whoever was hiding under there was gone. But possibly the scariest thing was yet to happen. As I stood in the storage room, there were loud metallic thumps coming from above my head. I looked up and saw indents slowly forming in the large air vent above me. Someone was crawling through the main vent, then just stopped literally above me. And then, bangs. Bangs like whoever was in there was trying to break open the floor of the air vent. I didn't know what was happening, but I was officially done with this. I ran up the stairs, locked up the school, and went home. I told Tom the partial truth the next day, that I thought I saw someone in the corner and it was gone when I went back. And I claimed there was nothing else I could say. Thank God it was my last week there, so it wasn't my concern anymore.